Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hello, my dear friends. Slows its pace, curiosity settles into a comfortable chair, and big questions are allowed to unfold without anyone banging a gong and demanding quick answers. This time we're easing into a subject that is both enormous and oddly intimate because it concerns every one of us, regardless of where we live, what language we speak, or whether we can trace our family tree back 6 generations or barely remember our great-grandparents' middle names. We are going to spend some time with the idea of origins, not just the neat version printed in textbooks or illustrated in museum panels with tidy arrows and carefully labeled skulls, but the deeper and more unsettling possibility that some of what we think we know about where we came from may be incomplete, misread, oversimplified, or in a few cases perhaps badly mistaken. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what the hour looks like in your part of the world right now. Is it very late and the house has gone still at last? Is it early morning with the day not quite assembled yet? Maybe it is raining softly outside, or maybe the night is dry and silent and your neighborhood has that particular hush that makes even distant traffic sound thoughtful. There is something fitting, I think, about people scattered across cities, coastlines, villages, tower blocks, suburbs, and farm roads, all pausing to think about beginnings at the same time. Each of us arriving here from our own small point on the map, carrying our own recent past into a much older one. And if this sort of slow wandering through science, history, and uncomfortable possibilities is the kind of thing that helps you unwind, focus, or drift gently towards sleep, I'd be very grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed as well. It helps this calm little project find the people who enjoy questions that are large enough to be interesting but quiet enough to keep company within the dark. I do hope this is soothing rather than overly provocative, though. If it does keep you awake for a while, at least you'll be awake with one of the better questions available to the human mind, which is not a terrible fate as these things go. Now, when people hear a title like "Everything We Thought About Our Origins May Be Wrong," there are usually 2 immediate reactions. The first is excitement, the second is suspicion. Excitement because humans are strangely drawn to hidden histories, missing evidence, forgotten worlds, and the possibility that some elegant official story may turn out to be far messier than expected. Suspicion because we have all seen enough wild claims, dramatic documentaries, and very confident people on the internet standing in front of grainy images to know that the phrase, "everything we know is wrong," is often followed by something that is unfortunately wrong in a much louder way. So let's begin with a useful bit of steadiness. This is not a story about throwing out science. It is a story about taking science seriously enough to admit that it changes. It revises. It corrects itself. It finds a bone where it expected none. A footprint where no one thought anyone had walked. A genetic trace that should not be there. A settlement older than the accepted timeline. A burial that does not fit the model. A tool too sophisticated for the people who supposedly made it, or perhaps not made it, depending on which expert you ask on which day of the week. Science is not threatened by being wrong. In fact, being wrong is one of its main methods. It just prefers to be wrong carefully with documentation. That really is what makes the story of our origin so fascinating. It is not a finished tale carved into stone. It is a reconstruction, and reconstruction is a delicate business. Imagine being asked to piece together the history of an entire civilization using a handful of broken dishes, a fire, several teeth, some fragments of old pollen, a suspiciously shaped rock, and the faint hope that nobody buried their rubbish in a confusing way. That is not an insult to archaeology, by the way. It is one of the reasons archaeology is so impressive. Archaeologists are expected to infer astonishing amounts from very little. Give them 3 post holes and a bit of charcoal, and by lunchtime they may have a theory about ritual practice, trade networks, seasonal movement, and whether someone sat near the entrance complaining about the weather. The truth is that the human past is not preserved for our convenience. Most of it is gone. Wood rots, cloth disappears, coastlines drown, rivers shift, fire destroys. Ice crushes, acidic soil eats bone. Entire landscapes that once held human lives now lie under cities, forests, deserts, or seas. Even when something survives, it may survive in fragments. A jaw here, a blade there, a few beads, a stain in the ground where a structure once stood. We speak about prehistory as if it were a broad, clear road stretching neatly behind us, but much of it is closer to a dark field crossed by partial tracks that vanish, reappear, split and lead in directions no one expected. And yet, from this patchy and stubborn record, humans have always tried to tell a story about themselves. We want to know where we began, how we became what we are, whether civilization rose slowly or suddenly, whether our ancestors were cleverer than we imagine, whether knowledge was built steadily or repeatedly lost and rebuilt, whether myths preserve memory, and whether the timeline hanging in our minds is too simple for the world that actually existed. These are not fringe questions. They sit very near the heart of anthropology, archaeology, genetics, geology, and history. Once you start looking closely, the comfortable version of our beginnings begins to wobble a little. For a long time, many people imagined human origins in a fairly linear way. First, there were primitive beings, then step by step they became a little less primitive. Stone tools improved, language emerged, settlements formed, farming began, villages became towns became cities, civilization arrived. The story had a clean progression to it, a sense of inevitable advancement, as though the human past were a ladder and each rung led sensibly to the next. That framework was appealing not only because it was easy to understand, but because it flatteringly placed modern people at the top of the arrangement. Looking back at the awkward early drafts, the trouble is reality rarely behaves with such neat obedience. Evolution does not march in a straight line. Cultures do not all develop in identical sequences. Knowledge is not always cumulative. Societies can become more complex, then collapse, then fragment, then preserve only pieces of what they once knew. Others can remain small and mobile not because they are less intelligent or less human or waiting to be upgraded, but because small and mobile happens to work rather well under certain conditions. The old habit of seeing the past as a queue of increasingly respectable ancestors has caused a good deal of misunderstanding. It made us underestimate ancient people. It made us treat some populations as relics instead of contemporaries. It made us assume that if something old was sophisticated, it must be an anomaly. And it made surprise feel more revolutionary than it really was. What if our beginnings were not a single clean beginning at all? What if the story looks less like a ladder and more like a braided river, splitting, rejoining, flooding, disappearing underground, and resurfacing elsewhere? What if there were lineages we barely know, migrations we have not mapped, encounters we still do not understand, and bursts of innovation that happened far earlier than once believed? What if some of the traits we thought emerged once in one place came together multiple times in different forms? What if some cities were not where we first expected them to be? What if some oral traditions preserve memories of coastlines that really did flood, skies that really did darken, or periods of disruption that geology can now confirm? None of these questions require abandoning evidence. Quite the opposite. They arise because there is more evidence now than there used to be, and it keeps making the older picture harder to keep tidy. Consider how much has changed just in recent decades. Ancient DNA has transformed the study of the past so dramatically that entire family trees have had to be redrawn. Species or populations once thought separate have turned out to have interbred. Migrations once imagined as simple waves now look more like repeated movements with detours, returns, and mixtures. Skeletons found in one region sometimes reveal ancestry from surprisingly far away. Cultural ideas, technologies, and people themselves did not always stay put. They traveled, met, blended, and sometimes vanished, leaving only faint traces that later turn up in a laboratory and politely ruin a long-established theory. Archaeology has done much the same. Sites older than expected have appeared. Monumental construction has shown up in periods once assumed too early for such organization. Evidence of symbolic behavior, ritual practice, seafaring, and complex social life has been pushed back again and again. It is a peculiar pattern in the sciences of the past. Again and again, ancient people turn out to have been more capable, more adaptable, more imaginative, and less conveniently simple than their descendants gave them credit for. We keep being surprised that they were, in every important sense, people. There is also a psychological side to all this. Humans like origin stories that are stable. A stable origin story tells us not only where we came from, but what kind of beings we are. It can support national histories, religious frameworks, cultural pride, scientific models, personal identity all at once. So when new evidence disturbs the picture, the reaction is not always calm interest. Sometimes it is defensiveness. Sometimes it is exaggeration in the opposite direction. A small revision gets inflated into a grand conspiracy. A genuine mystery becomes a magnet for nonsense. A gap in knowledge is treated either as scandal or as proof of someone's favorite impossible theory. Both reactions miss the more interesting point, which is that uncertainty is not a flaw in the story of our origins. It is part of the story. In fact, one of the oddest things about being human is that the species trying to understand human origins is itself a product of those origins. We are not standing outside the puzzle. We are inside it, interpreting traces left by people whose minds were not so different from ours, while using categories invented by recent societies with their own biases, blind spots, and habits of classification. We divide time into periods, assign labels, draw boundaries around cultures, and organize the past into maps and timelines because we need some way of thinking about it. But nature is under no obligation to respect our filing system. The people we separate into groups may not have seen themselves that way. The transitions we treat as major may have felt ordinary to those living through them. The categories we build can help us see, but they can also hide. Take something as seemingly straightforward as the word origin. Which origin do we mean? The origin of life? The origin of our species? The origin of behavior we would call modern? The origin of language, art, religion, agriculture, cities, civilizations? The origin of the stories we tell about ourselves? Each of these has its own evidence, its own debates, and its own habit of refusing to start in one tidy place. We often talk as though there was a moment when humanity arrived and began behaving recognizably like us. But the closer we look, the more gradual and scattered many of these developments seem to be. A symbolic mark here. Long-distance trade there, sophisticated hunting elsewhere, seafaring in one region, monumental construction in another, domestication at different times in different places, and social complexity emerging under very different circumstances. The more evidence we gather, the less likely it seems that there was one single switch flipped from primitive to advanced. That can be a little disappointing if one is hoping for a dramatic reveal. Humans do enjoy dramatic reveals. We like a hidden chamber, a lost map, a forbidden codex, a single object that changes everything. Real knowledge is often less theatrical. More often, the big revisions come from accumulations. A site redated by a few thousand years, a genetic signal found in a tooth, sediment cores showing environmental change, isotope analysis revealing migration, microscopic wear on a tool suggesting a different use. Each piece by itself may seem modest. Together they begin to alter the landscape. It is rather like watching a face come into view through fog, only to realize it is not one face at all, but many. And perhaps that is the first important adjustment we need to make as we begin this journey. The possibility that we've been wrong about our origins does not necessarily mean there is one hidden truth waiting dramatically behind a curtain. It may mean the truth is larger, more distributed, less flattering to our tidy narratives, and more human in the best sense, full of mixtures, recoveries, losses, coincidences, and stubborn survival. It may mean the earlier story of us was not simple enough to fit on a school poster. It may mean our ancestors were not walking neatly toward us, but living in worlds of their own, facing climates, landscapes, dangers, and opportunities that shaped them in ways we are only beginning to understand. You can feel the scale of that if you let yourself pause for a moment. Every building around you, every road, every book, language, every family, every custom, every recipe, every song, every nation, every argument on the internet, every clock, every satellite, every bedtime routine and morning alarm is built on a past that stretches back through layers so deep and so uneven that much of it still resists description. Somewhere in that vastness, people learned, forgot, adapted, crossed mountains, crossed water, buried their dead, painted walls, watched stars, told stories, lost worlds, survived winters, and became ancestors without ever knowing what a distant future would ask of their bones. There is something humbling in that, also something slightly funny. We are a species that can sequence ancient genomes and launch telescopes into space, and yet we still regularly discover that our earlier confidence about the distant past was somewhat premature. We build models, declare them sensible, and then a cave, a coastline, a burial ground, or an old stretch of sediment quietly clears its throat and suggests revisions. It is one of the more healthy embarrassments available to intelligent life. So over the course of this long exploration, we're going to look carefully at the clues we may have misunderstood, the ancestors who do not fit the old diagrams, the landscapes now hidden beneath water, ice, and sand, the role of catastrophe, the fragility of evidence, the uneasy relationship between myth and memory, and the deeper question of what changes if our account of where we came from turns out to be far less settled than we were taught. We will move slowly. We will stay grounded. We will not give the loudest answer simply because it is loud. Some possibilities will turn out to be stronger than others. Some mysteries will remain mysteries, and some ideas that sound dramatic at first will end up being less radical than the evidence itself, which is often where the real wonder lives. For now, though, it is enough simply to stand at the entrance to the question and admit that the story of our origins may not be the smooth tale of progress we inherited. It may be older in some places, stranger in others, interrupted, dispersed and revised by discoveries still being made. It may contain missing people, missing places, and missing chapters in the broadest sense of that word, though I promise not to lean on labels, and I shall try to behave. More importantly, it may ask us to let go of the comforting idea that the past was straightforward and patiently waiting for us to summarize it. Because the deeper one looks, the more the past behaves less like a settled archive and more like a conversation we arrived late to. Fragments are still surfacing. Methods are still improving. Entire assumptions are still being tested. And somewhere among the bones, tools, genes, sediments, stories, and ruins lies a picture of human beginnings that may be more complicated than the one most of us learned first. So, let's ease into the first set of clues and into the small, stubborn signs that perhaps the official story began to wobble long before most people noticed. When people imagine a scientific revolution in the story of human origins, they often picture something dramatic: a single skeleton lifted from the ground, a sealed chamber opened after thousands of years, a lost inscription translated at last, perhaps a stern-looking researcher removing their glasses and announcing that everything must now be reconsidered. Real change in this field is usually quieter than that. More often it begins with little signs that something does not quite fit: a date that seems too early, a tool found in the wrong layer, a burial that suggests unexpected ritual, a genetic signal which should not be there, a site in a place that the model said people had not reached yet. Then another clue appears and another. And before long, the official version begins to look less like a solid wall and more like a fence with rather a lot of gaps in it. That is often how the first serious revisions begin. Not with certainty, but with irritation. A good scientific model should explain the evidence reasonably well. If too many awkward facts keep turning up and refusing to sit quietly in the corner, the model starts to lose its dignity. This is exactly what has happened again and again in the study of our beginnings. The older picture was not necessarily foolish. In many cases, it was the best that could be done with the evidence available at the time. The trouble was that the picture became too comfortable. Once an idea settles into textbooks, museums, documentaries, and school lessons, it acquires an air of permanence that science itself never promised. For a long while, the past was arranged in a fairly orderly procession. Early humans were imagined as moving slowly from crude to clever, from simple bands to organized societies. New discoveries were expected to slot into that general sequence. When they did, everyone felt pleased. When they did not, there was often a strong temptation to explain them away, postpone their importance, or treat them as strange local exceptions. This habit was not always conscious. Scientists are human, and humans tend to notice things that confirm their expectations more easily than things that threaten them. It is one of the oldest mental shortcuts in the species, which is slightly unfortunate in a field dedicated to finding out what the species was actually doing. One of the earliest clues we may have misread lies in the very idea of primitiveness. For generations, ancient humans and human relatives were routinely described in a language that now feels embarrassingly loaded: primitive, crude, ape-like, unsophisticated. These words did more than describe. They shaped expectation. If you assume a group is primitive, then you are less likely to imagine them building with skill, navigating long distances, burying their dead carefully, using symbols, or adapting in flexible ways. Once that expectation settles in, evidence of sophistication starts to look suspicious, as though the people in question had somehow behaved above their assigned station. This has happened repeatedly with Neanderthals, who were long treated as the lumbering side branch in the human story, the heavy-browed cousins doomed by their own inadequacy. The old caricature painted them as dim, graceless, and incapable of the richer mental life reserved for us. Then the evidence began to accumulate. They made tools with planning and technique. They controlled fire. They hunted large game. They survived in harsh climates. They used pigments. They may have made personal ornaments. There is evidence suggesting care for injured individuals, which implies social obligation rather than simple brute survival. And then, perhaps most awkwardly for the old narrative, genetics revealed that Neanderthals did not merely vanish into irrelevance. They interbred with populations ancestral to many modern humans. The supposedly separate story was not separate at all. It was braided into ours. That should have been a deeply humbling moment, and in many ways it was. Not only because a mistaken image had persisted for so long, but because it showed how much our assumptions had been shaped by a desire for human uniqueness. We wanted the line leading to us to look special, perhaps cleaner than it really was. We preferred a triumphal story in which one kind of human clearly surpassed all rivals. Instead, the evidence suggested interaction, overlap, mixture, and a much less flattering neatness. It is harder to imagine oneself as the final polished product of history when one's family tree turns out to include branches long dismissed as evolutionary leftovers. And Neanderthals are only one example. The more fossils and genetic data have been studied, the more the human family has begun to look crowded, regional, and messy. Different populations overlapped in time. Some may have met, some certainly did. Some left bones but little else. Others left genes but no obvious name until recently. A finger bone from Denisova Cave in Siberia, modest enough to be overlooked by anyone hoping for cinematic grandeur, opened the door to an entire population previously unknown from the fossil record in any clear way. The Denisovans were not identified because someone uncovered a complete skeleton posed attractively for museum lighting. They emerged through ancient DNA. In other words, one of the biggest revisions to the human story began with a fragment in a laboratory. That alone should make us cautious about confidence. If a tiny bone can introduce an entire ghost population into the narrative, how many other presences have we missed simply because the record is uneven? How many times have we mistaken absence of evidence for evidence of absence? That phrase is repeated so often it risks sounding like a tired proverb, but in prehistoric research it is a daily practical warning. The past does not preserve itself evenly. One region yields generous fossil deposits. Another destroys bone completely. One population buries its dead in ways likely to endure. Another leaves far less that survives. A site may remain inaccessible, submerged, forested over, politically unstable, or simply undiscovered. From these patchy remains, we have often built surprisingly firm-seeming maps. It is no wonder some of them later need redrawing. Another clue we may have misread lies in stone tools, which sounds simple until one realizes how much interpretation they are forced to carry. For a long time, tools were treated almost like labels for stages of development. This shape of hand axe meant this period. That flaking technique meant that culture or species. Simpler tools implied simpler minds. More refined tools suggested cognitive advancement. There was logic in this, but also danger. Tools are shaped not only by intelligence but by need, available raw material, tradition, environment, mobility, and opportunity. A person using a simpler-looking tool is not necessarily less capable. They may simply be using what works. Imagine judging the sophistication of a modern household by finding only a kitchen spoon and concluding that these people had no grasp of electricity, literature, architecture, or mathematics. It would be an unfair assessment, though admittedly it would simplify some paperwork. Ancient toolkits can mislead us in similar ways. Some populations maintain methods that were reliable and efficient for immense stretches of time because the methods worked. Others changed more visibly. Variation does not always mean progress. Sometimes it just means difference. Yet older interpretations often lean toward a kind of technological snobbery, assuming that the newest-looking technique must belong to the most advanced humans and the simplest-looking one to those lagging behind. Dating methods, too, have played their part in the wobble. It is easy to forget that many earlier timelines were built with less precise tools than researchers have now. Dates could be revised by centuries or millennia as methods improved. Radiocarbon dating, stratigraphic analysis, luminescence dating, uranium series methods, paleomagnetic work, isotope studies. And genetic clocks all added layers of precision, though never perfect certainty. What matters here is not just that dates changed, but that changing dates often change the story. A site once thought comfortably recent might turn out to be astonishingly old. A migration placed after a climatic event might actually precede it. A technological innovation assigned to one population might need to be reconsidered if the layers were disturbed or the dating recalibrated. This is one reason the past often seems to move. It is not that events themselves are shuffling about mischievously in the dark. It is that our methods for locating them keep improving, and every improvement reveals how provisional some earlier confidence was. In the older public imagination, dates carried a misleading air of finality. People liked hearing that farming began here, symbolic behavior began there, this migration happened at such and such a time, and so on. But each of those claims sits on methods, assumptions, margins of error, and interpretations of context. None are meaningless. All are vulnerable to revision. The more the public hears exact years, the more it imagines certainty. The more scientists stare at the evidence, the more they see probabilities and ongoing arguments over coffee. Then there is the matter of where researchers chose to look in the first place. For quite a while, some regions attracted far more attention, funding, and prestige than others. Europe, parts of the Near East, and a handful of famous sites became central stages in the drama of origins. That was understandable for historical reasons, but it also distorted the picture. If you search most intensely where you already expect the key story to be, you are likely to find evidence that reinforces the centrality of those places. Meanwhile, equally important records elsewhere may remain understudied, underfunded, or interpreted through frameworks borrowed from different regions. The result is not exactly falsehood, but imbalance. Africa, of course, has long been crucial to the story of human origins, and rightly so. But even within Africa, the picture is changing as more work is done in more places. Asia has repeatedly produced evidence that complicates simple migration narratives. Island Southeast Asia, with its deep record of early seafaring and surprising hominin presence, is a good reminder that prehistoric humans were not always timid walkers waiting patiently for permission to cross water. Even the peopling of the Americas, once taught in a very tidy way, has become far more complicated as older sites, coastal possibilities, genetic evidence, and alternative routes are debated with increasing seriousness. Each new clue does not always overturn the previous one completely, but it often makes the old single-track story harder to maintain. Some of the most telling misread clues come from bias in what counted as intelligence. Older archaeology often privileged what looked familiar to modern Western habits. Permanent architecture, durable monuments, intensive agriculture, dense settlements, visible hierarchy, abundant material goods. If a society left fewer of those things, it was easy to classify it as less developed. But that confuses a particular form of complexity with complexity itself. Mobile hunter-gatherer groups could possess intricate ecological knowledge, sophisticated social structures, symbolic systems, long-distance exchange, seasonal planning, and flexible adaptation that left less obvious archaeological bulk. A city leaves stone. A seasonal knowledge system leaves subtler traces. Guess which one gets noticed first? This matters because the old origin stories often smuggled in a value judgment. They suggested that real history began when people settled down, built large things, and started behaving in recognizably bureaucratic ways. Everything before that could be treated as prelude. Yet the more evidence accumulates, the more that prelude starts to look like most of the song. Humans lived for vast stretches of time without cities, states, or writing. And during that time they spread across continents, adapted to climates, developed symbolic practices, created technologies, and formed cultures rich enough to carry memory, identity, and meaning. If we misread those traces because they do not resemble later civilization, then we are not just missing data. We are misunderstanding what a human society can be. Sometimes the misreading has been much more direct. The history of paleoanthropology includes some rather instructive embarrassments. Piltdown Man is the classic example. A fraudulent fossil presented in early 20th century England as a crucial missing link. It conveniently supported expectations of the time by combining a large brain case with an ape-like jaw, flattering the notion that brain expansion came early, and rather more conveniently still, placing a prestigious human ancestor in England. The hoax endured for decades before being exposed. Now, Piltdown is often told as a morality tale about scientific gullibility, which it certainly is. But it also shows how strongly people can accept bad evidence when it tells them what they are already inclined to believe. More common than outright fraud, though, is the quieter problem of interpretive drag. An old idea remains influential after the evidence around it has shifted. A site gets described one way in a major publication, and that description echoes for years. A species is characterized with confidence, and later findings struggle to dislodge the impression. A migration model becomes standard, and new anomalies are treated as complications rather than reasons to rethink the map. This is not sinister. It is simply how knowledge behaves in institutions. Changing a story takes time, especially when careers, textbooks, exhibitions, and public understanding are all woven into it. Science does correct itself, but it does not always pirouette. Ancient DNA has been particularly ruthless in this regard. It has shown that populations moved more than assumed, mixed more than assumed, and replaced or absorbed one another in patterns that do not fit older, tidy narratives. It has also exposed how misleading material culture can sometimes be when used alone. Similar pottery does not always mean the same people. A change in burial style does not always mean a complete replacement of population. Genetic continuity can sit alongside cultural change, and genetic change can occur with relatively subtle material shifts. In other words, pots are not people, which is a sentence archaeologists have had to repeat often enough that one suspects it should be printed on mugs. Then there are the clues buried in myth and oral tradition, a category that must be handled carefully because enthusiasm can run away with the evidence faster than a documentary narrator near a dramatic soundtrack. Still, dismissing such traditions entirely has also been a mistake. Some oral histories appear to preserve memories of real environmental events. Coastlines flooding, volcanic eruptions, unusual skies, vanished landscapes. This does not mean every myth is a factual archive in disguise. It does mean that human memory, when structured through repeated storytelling, can sometimes carry information much farther than earlier scholars allowed. For a long time, literate societies tended to privilege written records and treat oral cultures as historically vague. That bias may have caused us to ignore clues that were not in the format we preferred. The same goes for submerged landscapes. During periods of lower sea level, large areas now underwater were dry land available for migration, settlement, and ordinary human life. When sea levels rose after the last ice age, many of those regions vanished beneath the sea. If important stretches of early coastal history are now underwater, then one should not be too confident about claiming where people were or were not based only on surviving inland evidence. It is a bit like trying to reconstruct a nation's history after losing all its port cities. The record becomes skewed toward what remains visible, and visible is not always representative. All of this adds up to a rather important realization. The first clues were not necessarily absent. In many cases they were present all along, but they were filtered through assumptions about progress, intelligence, geography, civilization, and what counted as meaningful evidence. Sometimes the clue itself was incomplete. Sometimes the method was not ready. Sometimes the framework was too rigid. Sometimes the wrong question was being asked. We tend to imagine that new knowledge arrives because the world suddenly reveals new facts. Often it arrives because we finally learn how to see old facts differently. That is where the story becomes especially interesting. Once the first clues stop behaving, once dates slip, ancestors mingle, tools lose their tidy labels, oral memory becomes harder to dismiss, and landscapes once lived on turn out to be hidden beneath water or sediment, the older picture starts to loosen everywhere at once. The world before formal civilizations no longer looks like a thin waiting room where humanity sat around, inventing very little. It begins to look crowded with experiments, movements, local brilliance, forgotten adaptations, and traces of worlds that would later be named only after they were already gone. And that is where the ground under the next part of the story starts to shift a little more. Long before anyone used words like empire, kingdom, dynasty, or state, long before scribes pressed symbols into clay or kings had their names carved into stone, people were already living in ways that were far more organized, inventive, and socially complex than the old story used to allow. This is one of the places where the standard picture of our origins begins to wobble quite noticeably because many of us were taught some version of a very simple sequence. First came small wandering bands of hunter-gatherers. Then, after a long and rather uneventful pause, agriculture appeared. Villages formed, surpluses accumulated, hierarchies emerged, cities rose, civilization began. It was all presented as a sensible progression, almost like assembling flat-pack furniture, except with slightly more flint and fewer missing screws. The difficulty is that real human history, especially deep history, does not like sitting quietly inside a neat progression. Again and again, when archaeologists dig into the periods before what we usually call civilization, they find signs of planning, cooperation, ritual, long-distance connection, engineering, symbolic life, and social complexity that seem to have arrived before the official script said they should. Not everywhere at once, not in exactly the same form, and certainly not according to a tidy universal schedule, but often enough to make the old ladder of progress look suspiciously overconfident. Part of the problem begins with the word civilization itself. It sounds useful, and sometimes it is, but it has always carried a bit of baggage. Historically, people have used it not just to describe certain kinds of large, settled, administratively complex societies, but to rank human groups in a way that flatters the people doing the ranking. Civilized and uncivilized, advanced and primitive, settled and wandering, ordered and chaotic. The trouble with these pairs is that they make history sound like a moral sorting exercise instead of what it really was, which is a very long series of human experiments in survival, cooperation, memory, conflict, and adaptation under changing conditions. When we talk about the time before civilization had a name, we are not talking about a blank period. We are not talking about people waiting in a dimly lit hallway for history to begin. We are talking about tens of thousands of years in which human beings fully capable of observation, invention, affection, fear, humor, planning, and social obligation were building lives in landscapes that were often difficult, variable, and demanding. They knew plants, migration routes, seasons, coastlines, animal behavior, tool materials, and weather patterns with a depth of familiarity that would humble most modern people in roughly 3 afternoons. They raised children, buried the dead, marked places as important, told stories, formed alliances, developed identities, and very likely argued about whose turn it was to carry something heavy. For a long time, older scholars tended to underestimate these societies because they often did not leave behind the kinds of evidence that later civilizations leave in abundance. No palaces, no monumental archives, no royal inscriptions announcing that a ruler had conquered his enemies and also built a very lovely drainage system. Without those obvious signs, it was easy to imagine earlier human communities as socially thin, intellectually basic, and materially simple. But archaeology has a rather stubborn habit of uncovering evidence that does not respect these assumptions. Take large-scale ritual construction. There was once a strong tendency to assume that monumental architecture must follow settled agricultural life. It seemed intuitive. First, people would need food surplus, permanent settlement, and a stable hierarchy. Then, once all that was in place, they could organize labor for temples, monuments, and ceremonial structures. That sounded reasonable right up until sites like Göbekli Tepe began forcing a reconsideration. Here were enormous stone pillars arranged with planning and symbolic care, created by people who appear to have lived before the full establishment of farming in that region. One should always be cautious with sweeping conclusions, but the basic point remains deeply unsettling to the older model: large-scale collective projects. Ritual significance and organized labor may have emerged before agriculture was firmly in place, not after it. That reverses a cherished assumption. It suggests that gathering for ritual symbolism or social cohesion may not have been a side effect of settled civilization, but one of the things helping to drive new forms of settlement and cooperation in the first place. In other words, humans may not have built ceremonial worlds because they had already become socially complex. They may have become more socially complex partly because they were building ceremonial worlds, which is a very human possibility, really. Give people a shared meaning, a special place, and a reason to return to it often enough. And before long, someone is organizing the supplies, someone else is suggesting a calendar, and another person is standing nearby insisting they had proposed the whole thing much earlier. This matters because it reshapes how we think about the mental and social capacities of pre-civilized societies. These were not loose collections of individuals operating only at the level of immediate survival. To coordinate large gatherings, seasonal events, shared construction, or ritual activity across time requires memory, trust, repetition, and some agreed sense of significance. It requires people to do things that are not immediately reducible to eating the next meal. The old stereotype of early hunter-gatherer life as a purely hand-to-mouth existence becomes harder to maintain when the archaeological record starts showing durable places of assembly, symbolic art, grave goods, and regional patterns of exchange. And exchange is another important clue. Long before what we typically call civilization, materials were moving across surprising distances. Obsidian, shells, pigments, and other valued items appear far from their points of origin. That means people traveled, traded, gifted, or maintained social links over wider areas than older models sometimes acknowledged. A mobile or semi-mobile group is not necessarily an isolated one. In fact, mobility can be a very effective way to connect landscapes. Instead of imagining small prehistoric groups as trapped in narrow local existence, it may be more accurate in many cases to think of them as participating in broad and shifting networks of contact, with knowledge, materials, marriage ties, and traditions moving between communities in ways that do not preserve themselves neatly in the ground. Burial practices also complicate the story. When people bury their dead with care, with objects, pigments, positioning, or other signs of intention, they reveal more than emotion. They reveal social thought. They reveal memory. They reveal ideas about personhood, belonging, perhaps ancestry, perhaps something beyond death, or at the very least the importance of marking a life as more than discarded matter. Such practices appear deep in prehistory. Not everywhere, not always, and not in one universal form, but often enough to show that symbolic life runs far older than the older staircase model preferred. Humans were not waiting for civilization to become meaningful creatures. Meaning was present early, and it seems to have mattered enough to shape action. The same applies to art. Cave paintings, engravings, figurines, beads, body adornment, deliberate use of pigment, carved objects. All these are signs of minds operating well beyond mere subsistence. Art is sometimes discussed as though it were an optional luxury that arrived once survival was comfortably sorted. But that is a very modern misunderstanding. Symbolic expression may be tied to identity, ritual, memory, teaching, territorial marking, courtship, storytelling, status, or shared belief. In other words, it can be central to survival in a social species. A painted cave wall is not just decoration. It may be part of how a group understands animals, landscape, danger, ancestry, or themselves. And once again, this means the world before named. Civilization was already full of people doing recognizably human things with thought and intention. One of the biggest mistakes in the old framework was treating agriculture as the single great dividing line between real complexity and everything that came before. Agriculture certainly changed human life dramatically. It allowed denser populations, new labor patterns, food storage, property relations, seasonal commitments, and eventually all sorts of familiar headaches involving taxation, hierarchy, and someone in authority deciding the grain belongs to them now. But agriculture was not an instant upgrade from simple to complex. In some places it emerged gradually. In others it coexisted for long periods with older subsistence practices. In still others, people may have engaged in forms of plant management or environmental shaping that do not fit cleanly into the tidy category of either foraging or farming. The line between those worlds was often blurred. People could encourage certain plants, return seasonally to productive areas, alter landscapes through burning, manage animal populations, harvest on a schedule, and store food, all without becoming settled agriculturalists in the later textbook sense. That should make us wary of binary thinking. The past was not cleanly divided into before farming and after farming, before civilization and after civilization, as if one Tuesday nobody had granaries and by Thursday everyone had temple accountants. Real transitions stretch, overlap, hesitate, and vary by region. And what we call civilization may be less a single invention than a cluster of social developments that assemble differently in different places. Jericho offers a useful example. Here we see very early large settlement, substantial architecture, and communal effort appearing astonishingly far back in time. The famous tower and walls have prompted decades of debate about function and interpretation. But whatever final conclusions one prefers, the site stands. As evidence that long before the polished image of later civilization, people were already capable of sustained communal building and settlement. That alone makes the old assumption of a long, barren gap between small foraging bands and organized collective life much harder to defend. Saddle-her-uke complicates things in another direction. It does not fit neatly into later urban expectations. Yet it shows dense settlement, repeated rebuilding, rich symbolic interiors, and a social world that seems deeply structured even if not arranged around obvious palaces or central ruling monuments. Houses were packed together, entered through roofs, filled with layered evidence of domestic and ritual activity. This is not a crude halfway stage stumbling toward civilization. It is its own kind of social world, one that reminds us how dangerous it is to measure all complexity against the later city-state template. And perhaps that is the real adjustment we need to make. The period before civilization had a name was not one uniform condition. It was a vast collection of human ways of being. Some groups were highly mobile, some more settled. Some built monuments. Some built knowledge systems that left far less durable evidence. Some stored food heavily. Some moved with the seasons. Some lived in rich coastal zones. Some in river valleys. Some in cold steppe environments. Some in forests. Their technologies, social arrangements, rituals, and adaptive strategies varied enormously. If we insist on reading all of them as preliminary versions of later civilization, we miss what they actually were. There is also a modern habit of assuming that permanence equals sophistication. It is an understandable bias. Stone survives. Bureaucracy leaves records. Walls impress tourists. But permanence can be a trap in interpretation. A mobile people who understand their environment in extraordinary detail, maintain far-reaching kin ties, navigate large territories, and survive through flexibility may leave. Less archaeological bulk than a sedentary society that collapses after exhausting local resources. Which one is more sophisticated depends very much on the question you ask. If the question is who built the thicker wall, then perhaps the settled society wins. If the question is who could sustain life across variable landscapes for millennia without wrecking the system, the answer may be less obvious. What this means for the story of our origins is slightly uncomfortable because it removes the flattering simplicity. There was no universal queue in which all human groups waited their turn to become civilized. There were many experiments, many stable ways of living, many forms of knowledge, and many kinds of social order. Some led toward dense urban life, some did not. Some may have chosen against intensification when conditions allowed. Others may have drifted in and out of it. In that light, civilization begins to look less like the inevitable destination of humanity and more like one highly influential family of strategies among several, though admittedly one with a great fondness for stone walls, surplus grain, and eventually paperwork. Even climate plays a role in this reconsideration. The end of the last ice age brought huge environmental changes. Sea levels rose, ecosystems shifted, animal ranges changed, productive zones moved. In such circumstances, human groups were not passively waiting for nature to instruct them what came next. They were adapting, experimenting, gathering differently, moving differently. Perhaps settling more in some places, intensifying resource use in others, building new social solutions where old ones no longer fit. What later gets called civilization may have emerged not because humans suddenly became clever enough, but because changing environments created new pressures and opportunities for already clever humans to organize themselves differently. That point is worth lingering on because it changes the emotional tone of the story. The old narrative sometimes makes it sound as though before civilization people were in a kind of developmental childhood. Then at last they grew up into cities, writing, and government. But the archaeological record suggests something else. It suggests mature, capable humans responding to the worlds available to them. They were not mentally unfinished. They were historically situated. If they did not build cities, that does not mean they could not think. If they did not write, that does not mean they had no history. If they left fewer monuments, that does not mean they lacked structure, memory, or belief. In fact, one begins to suspect that the phrase "before civilization" can mislead almost as much as it helps. It encourages us to define these societies by what they had not yet become instead of by what they were. That is always a risky way to describe other people, even if those people have been dead for 10,000 years. No one likes being introduced chiefly as a prelude to someone else. Ancient humans deserve the courtesy of being seen on their own terms where the evidence allows it. And once that shift happens, once the world before named civilization stops looking empty and starts looking dense with human experimentation, the story of our beginnings becomes stranger and more interesting at the same time. The roots of organized religion, symbolic life, territorial identity, trade, architecture, social inequality, and large-scale cooperation may all lie deeper, earlier, and less neatly than older models assumed. Some features we used to associate only with civilization may have older ancestry. Others may have emerged more than once. Still, others may have existed in forms we do not easily recognize because we keep looking for familiar arrangements like courts, armies, or written decrees. This is also where the family tree starts to become more complicated, because once we admit that the human world before formal civilization was varied, connected, and already rich with experimentation, we have to face another uncomfortable possibility. The populations moving through that world, meeting across it, and contributing to what came later may not fit the simple ancestral picture we once preferred. Some of them may not sit neatly on the lines we drew at all. If there is one image of human origins that has proven especially difficult to let go of, it is the family tree. It is such a tidy image, so reassuringly well behaved. A trunk, some branches, perhaps a few twigs, all arranged in a sensible way with one line eventually leading to us. It gives the impression that ancestry can be drawn neatly, labeled clearly, and understood at a glance. As if the history of humanity were a pleasant afternoon in a botanical garden with little signs beside everything. The trouble is that the deeper scientists look, the less our past resembles a tree, and the more it starts to look like something messier, more entangled, and rather less willing to sit still for a diagram. That matters because for a long time, the standard picture of our origins depended on a fairly simple branching model. One hominin species would give rise to another, that one to another, and somewhere along the way our own species, Homo sapiens, would emerge as the last successful branch. There might be some sidelines, a few dead ends, maybe a robust-looking cousin or two who failed to make the final cut, but the overall story still felt manageable. There was a path, there was direction, there was a sense that if we just found enough skulls, jaws, and leg bones, we could line them up like an ancestral parade and watch ourselves becoming ourselves. Nature, unfortunately, has not cooperated with this ambition. The more fossils, genomes, and archaeological sites are studied, the more obvious it becomes that the human story is not a neat procession. Different human groups overlapped in time. Some lived in very different environments. Some evolved surprising traits. Some left fossils, but little genetic information. Others left genetic signatures with hardly any visible bodies to introduce them. Some interbred. Some may have remained isolated for long periods. Some challenge our assumptions about intelligence, body size, adaptation, and even what counts as recognizably human. What once looked like a family tree is starting to resemble a family argument, with branches crossing, relatives turning up unexpectedly, and at least one ancestor appearing to have been left out of the paperwork entirely. Neanderthals are perhaps the most famous example of an ancestor figure who does not fit the old diagram. For much of the 20th century, they were cast as our doomed cousins. Strong but slow-minded, tough but culturally limited. A side branch. The story was simple enough to be popular. Modern humans arrived. Neanderthals could not compete. Curtain down. It was a clean narrative, and like many clean narratives, it turned out to be too clean. First came the steady accumulation of evidence that Neanderthals were more capable than the stereotype allowed. They made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, hunted large animals with skill, adapted to difficult climates, and likely engaged in symbolic behavior. Then ancient DNA arrived and made the situation considerably more awkward for the tidy model. It turned out that Neanderthals were not just a neighboring branch we passed on the evolutionary roadside. They interbred with the ancestors of many living humans. In other words, the branch was not separate enough to stay separate. That single fact changes the emotional tone of the story. Once interbreeding enters the picture, the family tree loses its innocence. It is no longer a set of clean, diverging lines. It becomes a network of populations splitting and reconnecting. Neanderthals were not merely spectators to our rise. They were participants in the formation of who many of us are. Their genes remain in living people outside Africa in varying proportions, influencing aspects of immunity, physiology, and other traits in ways researchers are still working out. That does not mean we are part Neanderthal in the simplistic storybook sense. It means the boundary between them and us was more porous than the older account wanted to admit. And if that alone was not enough to disturb the old arrangement, then Denisovans arrived, which is perhaps a strange way to phrase it, given that no one can exactly picture them arriving anywhere. They emerged into science through a fingerbone, a few teeth, and ancient DNA from Denisova Cave in Siberia. There was no handsome, complete skeleton waiting to make a museum curator's life easier. Instead, genetic evidence revealed a distinct population closely related to Neanderthals but not the same. One that had also contributed DNA to living humans, especially in parts of Asia and Oceania. That is an astonishing revision when you pause over it. An entire population of ancient humans, largely invisible in the fossil record as a recognizable type, announced itself through genetics and immediately complicated the old story. The Denisovans are especially valuable because they expose how incomplete our picture has been. If a major human lineage could remain obscure until a bit of DNA from a cave brought it into focus, then one must entertain the possibility that other populations existed that we have not yet identified clearly. Some may be represented by fragmentary fossils not yet placed correctly. Some may remain known only through genetic traces, little shadows in the genomes of living people suggesting encounters with groups whose bones we have not securely matched. The more the evidence expands, the less justified it seems to assume that the map of human ancestry is nearly complete. This is where the idea of ghost populations comes in, and it is every bit as intriguing as it sounds, though perhaps slightly less theatrical than the phrase suggests. In genetics, a ghost population is not a group haunting caves with unfinished business. It is a population inferred from genetic patterns even when direct fossil or skeletal evidence is poor or absent. Scientists notice traces that do not fit known lineages cleanly. The simplest explanation is that some as yet unidentified population contributed ancestry somewhere along the line. In Africa, especially where the deepest roots of Homo sapiens lie and where fossil preservation is highly uneven in some regions, there may have been structured populations and interbreeding events far more complicated than the old linear story imagined. Rather than a single neatly bounded origin point from which modern humans radiated in orderly fashion, there may have been multiple interacting populations across the continent exchanging genes, separating, rejoining, and slowly contributing to what became us. That possibility is significant because it weakens the old image of a singular origin event in one isolated group that then simply spread outward unchanged. Instead, Homo sapiens may have emerged through a broader patchwork of populations connected over time across different ecological zones. In such a model, no single skull or site can carry the whole meaning of the first modern human. Traits we associate with modernity may have arisen in pieces in different groups at different times, then come together gradually through interaction. This makes the story less dramatic in one sense because there is no single triumphant debut, but it makes it far more plausible and far more interesting. Humans, after all, are a social species. Why would our deepest origins be simpler than our later history? Some of the ancestors who unsettle the family tree do so not through genetics but through morphology and geography. Homo floresiensis, found on the Indonesian island of Flores, is one such case. Popularly nicknamed the Hobbit, which is understandable though not especially technical. This small-bodied hominin lived surprisingly recently and combined a tiny stature with a mosaic of features that sparked immediate debate. Was it a pathological modern human? A dwarf descendant of Homo erectus? A lineage with even deeper roots? Whatever the final placement, the discovery was a firm reminder that the human story included forms no one had really expected. On an island in a relatively recent period lived a population of small humans with stone tools and an evolutionary history still not fully agreed upon. That is not the sort of thing one predicts from a simple family tree unless the tree has started drinking. Island environments complicate human evolution in all kinds of ways. Isolation can produce unusual body sizes, distinct adaptations, and long persistence of populations that elsewhere disappear. Flores is not alone in this regard. Homo luzonensis, discovered in the Philippines, adds further complexity. Known from limited remains but distinct enough to suggest another unusual hominin population in island Southeast Asia. It points again to a world in which human diversity was broader and more regionally varied than once assumed. These were not just footnotes to the main event. They were part of the human world, living in places where movement, sea crossings, isolation, and adaptation created lineages that do not fit comfortably into the old parade of ever more familiar ancestors. Then there is Homo naledi, found in South Africa, a species that seems almost designed to irritate anyone fond of straight lines. Homo naledi had a fascinating mixture of traits. Some were more primitive-looking in certain anatomical respects, while others appeared more modern. Its brain size was relatively small, which would once have encouraged a great many condescending assumptions. Yet the context of the finds raises provocative questions about behavior, possibly even deliberate body disposal deep within cave chambers. That interpretation remains debated, as serious things tend to be. But even without rushing beyond the evidence, Homo naledi is a reminder that brain size alone is not a sufficient shorthand for all the behaviors people once wanted it to predict. The old habit of arranging hominins from crude and small-brained to larger-brained and fully human becomes harder to defend when species show mosaics of traits that refuse to line up in that order. Mosaic evolution is a phrase worth keeping close here. It means that different traits do not all evolve together in one clean package. A population may show modern-looking feet and more archaic shoulders, or a more derived face with an older-looking brain case, or some other mixed arrangement. Evolution is not a synchronized dance in which every part of the body updates on the same beat. It is patchy, contingent, responsive to different pressures, and often local. That should already make us cautious about reading a fossil as though it were a full announcement of its place in a grand sequence. A jaw, a pelvis, a hand, a brow ridge, a foot. Each carries information, but not always the sort that lets one stamp ancestor or side branch with as much confidence as earlier generations sometimes did. Even Homo erectus, once treated as a more straightforward member of the lineage, becomes more complicated the longer one looks. This was a highly successful and widespread hominin present across vast stretches of time and geography. Some forms of Homo erectus or closely related groups spread far beyond Africa. They were adaptable, persistent, and not especially interested in conforming to the role of simple stepping stone. The category itself may contain more diversity than once appreciated, when a species lasts a very long time and covers wide territory. One should not expect it to remain static. Yet textbooks often prefer a single representative figure, as though hundreds of thousands of years and multiple environments ought to produce one standard-issue ancestor. The deeper issue here is not merely taxonomic confusion, though there is certainly enough of that to keep paleoanthropologists supplied with lively conference discussions. It is that the human family did not evolve in an orderly queue. Multiple hominin populations were alive at the same time. Some had wide ranges, some were regional specialists, some encountered each other, some exchanged genes, some vanished, some left descendants directly or indirectly. At various points in the Pleistocene, the world seems to have contained a richer diversity of humans than the old modern imagination allowed. Not one humanity marching steadily towards civilization, but several humanities, if one may put it that way, each adapted to its own world. each running its own experiment in what being human might look like under those conditions. That realization has consequences for the word ancestor itself. We often use it too casually. We speak as though an ancestor must look like an earlier, rougher version of us. But real ancestry and evolution does not have to flatter our desire for familiarity. Some ancestors may have looked unexpectedly different. Some populations related to us may have contributed only partially. Some may not be direct ancestors at all, but close cousins whose existence still shaped the world in which our lineage evolved. A family tree invites us to ask, which branch leads to me? A more accurate image might encourage a different question. What network of populations, encounters, separations, and recombinations made my existence possible at all? In Africa, this question becomes especially profound. The oldest and deepest history of our species lies there. But the story is not simply one of a single and an outward spread. Fossils from different African regions show combinations of traits that complicate any easy declaration of the first true modern human. Genetic evidence suggests ancient population structure within Africa, perhaps long-standing regional diversity. Climatic shifts would have opened and closed corridors of movement, separated groups, then brought them back into contact. Lakes expanded and shrank. Deserts advanced and retreated. Forests shifted. In that kind of landscape, one should expect branching, isolation, mixing, and repeated adaptation. The family tree model with its one clear trunk begins to look not merely oversimplified but positively optimistic. There is also a subtle emotional bias at work in how people respond to these ancestors who do not fit the diagram. We like knowing who we are. More than that, we like knowing who we are not. The old image of a single successful lineage rising above all others offered a flattering story of exceptionalism. We became modern. They did not. We inherited the future. They became fossils. But once into breeding, overlap and shared ancestry become central to the story. That moral neatness falls apart. The others are not wholly other, nor is our own emergence as solitary or pristine as earlier narratives implied. We are not the final polished product of a clean branch. We are the outcome of a long and entangled history in which human diversity was real, persistent, and sometimes intimate. That makes the old phrase, missing link, seem almost quaint now. It belongs to a time when people imagined evolution as a chain with obvious gaps waiting to be filled by the right fossil. What the evidence increasingly suggests is not a chain with missing links, but a web with many broken strands, some of them rejoined, some invisible, some still missing entirely. There may never be one perfect specimen that resolves all ambiguity. Instead, understanding comes through accumulation, fossils, genomes, geology, climate records, archaeology, and better models of population interaction. Each adds detail, but often at the price of simplicity. This is a trade science should gladly accept, even if it makes dinner party explanations more difficult. And dinner parties, one must admit, are where the family tree model still performs very well. It is easy to point to a picture and say, this species led to that one, then eventually to us. It is much harder to say, well, several populations with overlapping ranges and varying degrees of reproductive compatibility were interacting across shifting environments, and modern humans emerge from a structured ancestral landscape rather than a single clean branch. One can see why the simpler version became popular. It fits more comfortably beside the cheese board. But comfort is not the same as truth. Once we admit that the ancestors do not fit the old tree, other questions begin to press in. If the human family was more diverse, more entangled, and more regionally complicated than we thought, then the worlds those populations inhabited may also have been more connected, more varied, and less isolated than our early maps suggested. Some of the places they lived, traveled through, and perhaps even flourished in may not be plainly visible to us now at all. Sea levels rose. Ice advanced and retreated. Deserts shifted. Whole habitable landscapes disappeared from easy view, taking portions of the story with them. And that begins to matter rather a lot when considering where some of the missing pieces may have gone. One of the biggest problems in trying to understand our origins is that a large part of the evidence may be missing for reasons that have nothing to do with human intelligence, human absence, or even human mystery in the dramatic sense. Sometimes the problem is simpler than that. Sometimes the places where people once lived are no longer easy to reach because they are underwater, buried under desert, locked beneath ice, or covered by layers of sediment that have taken thousands of years to settle into silence. This is a fairly serious inconvenience for archaeology, which tends to prefer its ancient settlements on dry land, not 12 meters below the sea or under enough sand to make a trowel feel personally insulted. It is easy to forget how unstable the Earth's surface has been over the timescales that matter for deep human history. We look at modern coastlines, modern deserts, modern river valleys, and modern ice-ferry landscapes and treat them as though they were the stage on which the human story was always set. But they were not. Coastlines shifted. Sea levels rose and fell dramatically. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Green regions dried out. Dry regions filled with water. Plains became seabeds. River systems changed course. Forests spread and vanished. If ancient people followed resources, coasts, rivers, animal migrations, and favorable climates, then many of the most important places in their lives may now lie in landscapes that look nothing like the ones they knew. That matters because human beings, like most sensible creatures, have often preferred the same kinds of places. We like fresh water, manageable climate, access to food, routes of movement, and edges where land and water meet. Coastal zones, in particular, are tremendously attractive. They offer fish, shellfish, seabirds, marine mammals, transport routes, and often milder local conditions. Estuaries, river mouths, and continental shelves would have been especially valuable. Yet these are also among the areas most vulnerable to sea level rise after the last ice age. So if one were designing a perfect system for hiding early evidence of human settlement, adaptation, and movement, one could do worse than drowning large stretches of the ancient coastline and then waiting patiently for future archaeologists to argue about what is missing. During the last glacial maximum, when massive ice sheets held much of the world's water, sea levels were far lower than they are today. Vast areas now underwater were then dry land. Continental shelves extended outward. Island chains were joined to mainlands. Narrow straits became wider passages or disappeared entirely. Places that now look isolated by ocean were once connected by broad plains or stepped coastal routes. This changes the map of human movement in a very practical way. It means some migration paths we once imagined as difficult or unlikely may have been easier than assumed. It also means settlement zones that would have been ideal for prehistoric communities are now hidden beneath seas, bays, and continental margins. Doggerland is one of the best-known examples. Today, the North Sea separates Britain from mainland Europe, and it is easy to picture that separation as ancient and obvious. But for long stretches of prehistory, there was a large, habitable land mass in between, a broad plain with rivers, marshes, lakes, and game. People lived there, moved through it, hunted there, and made it part of their world. Then, as sea levels rose, Doggerland was gradually flooded and lost. What remains of that world survives only in fragments brought up by fishing nets, seabed surveys, cores, and the occasional deeply inconvenient reminder that an entire inhabited landscape can vanish from everyday sight. When we talk about human prehistory in northern Europe without mentally restoring that missing land, we are working from a map with a major piece torn out, and Doggerland is hardly unique. The Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia is another enormous example. Today, the islands of Indonesia can give the impression of long-standing separation, but during periods of lower sea level, huge areas were connected into much larger land masses. This would have altered migration, ecology, and contact in major ways. Even where open water still needed to be crossed, the geography of that world was not the same as the one we see on a modern globe. The people moving through those landscapes were not navigating our coastlines. They were navigating theirs. That distinction matters because it shifts the level of difficulty, the likely routes, and the pattern of preserved evidence. If you search only on present shorelines for traces of ancient coastal populations, you are often searching too late. The same is true for the peopling of the Americas. For years, public understanding centered heavily on the idea of an inland migration route through an ice-free corridor. That model had a certain clarity, and like many clear models, it became more rigid in the imagination than the evidence strictly justified. Over time, however, the possibility of coastal movement gained increasing attention. If people moved along Pacific coastal environments using shoreline resources, then many of the sites that would help prove or detail that movement may now be submerged. Once sea levels rose, campsites, middens, tool-making areas, and seasonal settlements could have been inundated. In other words, one reason the evidence once seemed sparse may be that a good portion of it is underwater, which is not ideal if your excavation budget is already looking nervous. Submerged landscapes do more than hide sites. They distort whole theories. Archaeology has always been biased toward what survives and what is accessible. Stone survives well. Dry caves preserve beautifully. Monumental architecture draws attention. But fishing camps, seasonal coastal settlements, wooden structures, woven materials, shoreline pathways, and low-built habitation sites can disappear with remarkable efficiency once rising seas, erosion, and sediment get involved. That creates a dangerous illusion. It makes inland durable, and later sites look more important simply because they are still visible. Meanwhile, a much older and possibly very significant coastal story has been literally sunk out of view. There is something almost unfair about it. Ancient people probably loved coastlines for good practical reasons. Modern researchers also love coastlines because coastlines are where so much human life tends to happen. Yet the coastlines available to us are not the ones that mattered most to people 20,000 years ago. It is as though humanity thoughtfully held much of its early discussion in a room that later slid into the sea. Ice creates a different kind of problem. Glaciated regions are not just cold, they are destructive archives. Advancing ice sheets can scour landscapes, crush sediments, erase surface traces, and transport material in ways that make reconstruction difficult. Retreating ice, meanwhile, reshapes terrain, redirects water, and leaves behind environments very different from those that existed before. In some northern regions, entire chapters of earlier habitation may have been scraped away or deeply altered. At the same time, glacial margins and periglacial zones could also be productive spaces for humans and animals, especially during periods of environmental change. People lived near edges, adapted to cold climates, followed migratory game, and occupied places that now carry only partial traces of those lives. Permafrost, to be fair, can sometimes preserve things beautifully. Frozen ground has given us mammoths, tools, human remains, and astonishing organic material in places where decay is slowed to a crawl. But preservation in one pocket does not cancel destruction across wider regions. Nor does it solve the larger issue that ice ages rearrange geography on a continental scale. If we imagine the world of ancient people using modern maps without accounting for ice extent, lowered seas and altered ecosystems, we make them inhabitants of the wrong Earth. Sand is quieter, but just as effective. Deserts have a habit of making the past disappear in a particularly thorough manner. Wind moves dunes. Sediment buries camps, burials, and paths. Entire river systems can vanish beneath later deposits. Rock art may survive in sheltered places, but ordinary evidence of daily life becomes patchy and elusive. This is especially important because some of today's deserts were not always deserts. The Sahara is perhaps the grandest example of all. The modern Sahara, vast and dry, can feel like a natural barrier that has always been there, dividing regions and limiting movement. But during greener phases in the past, large areas of the Sahara were habitable with lakes, rivers, grasslands, and animal life supporting human populations. This was not a marginal, empty zone. It was at times a lived-in world. That single fact has enormous implications. If the Sahara periodically opened into a network of habitable corridors and rich landscapes, then the movement of people, ideas, technologies, and genes across Africa may have been facilitated in ways older fixed maps did not capture well. Populations could disperse, reconnect, separate again, and adapt across environmental windows that later vanished. Once aridity returned, many of the traces of those worlds were buried, eroded, or left in places difficult to detect. So when geneticists speak of ancient population structure in Africa and archaeologists point to complex regional patterns, one must remember that part of the stage itself has changed dramatically. Some of the missing connections may have run through landscapes that are now dry silence. Arabia presents a similar issue. Long treated in older imagination as mostly a barrier or empty passage, it has increasingly revealed evidence of greener intervals, lakes, wetter corridors, and human presence during periods when conditions were more favorable. Again, this matters not because it provides one magical answer, but because it warns against assuming that current harshness reflects ancient impossibility. A dry landscape today may have been attractive thousands of years ago. A submerged gulf may have been fertile land. A barren shelf may once have held river valleys and game. The past keeps reminding us that. It refuses to sit obediently beneath modern climate maps. Even beneath forests there are lost worlds. Dense vegetation can hide earthworks, settlements, agricultural modifications, and transportation networks for centuries. In some tropical regions, soil acidity destroys organic remains quickly, making excavation difficult even where complex societies existed. Recent remote sensing methods, especially LiDAR, have revealed extensive human modification of landscapes in places once assumed to be sparsely occupied or incapable of supporting large, organized populations. It turns out that if you remove the trees from your map, some very inconvenient evidence appears underneath. This lesson, though more often associated with later complex societies than with the deepest origins, still belongs to the same general pattern. Human life has often been underestimated because the environments covering it were too difficult, too dense, too wet, too dry, or too altered for earlier investigators to read clearly. What all of this adds up to is a basic but profound problem. Our archaeological record is not just incomplete, it is environmentally biased. We have a better chance of finding some kinds of ancient worlds than others. Caves are kind to us. Dry sediments can be kind. Stone-rich occupations are kind. Drowned coasts, shifting dunes, glacially scraped plains, acidic tropical soils, and unstable river systems are much less cooperative. So when we build grand theories of where people lived, how they moved, and when complexity appeared, we are often theorizing from the survivors of a preservation lottery. This is one reason bold statements about first should always make us a little cautious. The first known settlement, the first symbolic site, the first major coastal occupation, the first migration into a region. These phrases are useful, but they can also mislead. What we often mean is the earliest example currently visible to us under the present conditions of discovery and preservation. That is a much less glamorous phrase, and it fits very badly on a museum banner, but it is closer to the truth. Lost worlds beneath sea, sand, and ice mean that some firsts may not be first at all. They may merely be first among what has not vanished. There is also a human tendency to imagine lost worlds as necessarily exotic. Sunken civilizations, vanished empires, advanced forgotten cultures, all the usual dramatic furniture. But the truly important lost worlds may have been ordinary in the best sense. Not Atlantis, but estuaries. Not a secret global empire, but repeated camps along drowned shorelines. Not impossible machines, but fishing grounds, burial sites, tool workshops, and seasonal gathering places. The loss of such ordinary places may actually matter more for understanding our origins than the fantasy of a single hidden super-civilization. Human history is built far more from repeated ordinary life than from spectacular legend. A shoreline where families return for generations can shape migration, identity, and adaptation more deeply than any number of Bronze Age fever dreams involving crystal towers. Underwater archaeology is beginning to change some of this, but it is difficult work. Locating submerged prehistoric sites is not as straightforward as strolling into a trench with a notebook and a hopeful expression. One must reconstruct ancient coastlines, identify paleo rivers, understand changing sedimentation, scan wide areas of seabed, and then somehow investigate places that have been inundated, eroded, and covered for millennia. It is expensive, slow, and technically demanding, which means the underwater record is still in its relative infancy compared with land archaeology. That should make us humble. It means we are probably still missing significant parts of the human story, especially in regions where lowered Ice Age shorelines would have been highly attractive to ancient populations. It also changes how we think. About memory, when landscapes vanish, memory behaves differently. Some places are abandoned gradually. Others are lost to sudden floods, shoreline retreat, or changing watercourses. Communities witnessing such changes might preserve them in stories, rituals, place names, warnings, or traditions that outlast the physical world they describe. A drowned plain becomes a tale of land beneath the sea. A lost lake becomes an ancestral place no one can now point to directly. A drowned island shelf becomes a remembered route, then a legend, then perhaps eventually a myth. This is not to say every story of flood or lost land is a literal historical record. That would be far too easy, and the past is rarely that obliging. But once we recognize how many habitable worlds really were transformed or submerged, the boundary between environmental history and cultural memory begins to look more interesting. The same may be true of deserts. A region that dries dramatically over generations or centuries changes not only migration and subsistence but memory and identity. Lakes disappear, roots fail, pasture becomes dust, old settlements are abandoned. Places once central become inaccessible or meaningless to later outsiders. What survives may be fragments of story, sacred significance attached to now empty places, or traces half buried in sand until some satellite image or excavation cuts through the silence. Again, the old archaeological habit of favoring what is visible can make such worlds seem less important than they were. Yet for the people who lived there, they may have been central. And all this returns us to the original question of origins in a slightly unsettling way. If the earliest chapters of human expansion, adaptation, and social development played out across landscapes that are now altered or hidden, then our understanding of where we came from is being built on a map with major absences. Some routes are missing, some settlements are missing, some interactions are missing. Some of the places where people learn to live with changing climate, shifting coastlines, and disappearing homelands are missing. We are not reading the full archive. We are reading what the planet happened to leave on the accessible shelves. There is no need to leap from that fact into melodrama. The point is not that the truth is unknowable or that every accepted model is doomed. The point is that the past we reconstruct is necessarily filtered through preservation. A coastline that nurtured generations can vanish. A fertile shelf can drown. A green corridor can become desert. An inhabited plain can be ground under ice. And once enough of those losses accumulate, the surviving story begins to lean toward the regions and lifestyles most likely to remain visible. That creates a very real risk of misunderstanding. We may end up mistaking durable visibility for historical importance. So when we think about the origins of human movement, adaptation, and perhaps even some of the earliest forms of organized life, we have to keep these missing worlds in mind, not as fantasy realms but as real landscapes once walked, fished, crossed, remembered, and lost. The deeper we take that seriously, the more another possibility begins to open up. Some of the oldest stories people later told about floods, vanished lands, ancestors on the move, or worlds remade by water and sky may not have come from nowhere after all. There is a particular moment in almost every discussion about origins when someone, usually with a thoughtful expression and a slightly lowered voice, asks whether the old myths might contain some truth. After all, it is a dangerous moment because two bad habits tend to arrive at once. One group hears the question and immediately decides that every legend is a coded historical document waiting to be decoded by the right enthusiast with a map and too much coffee. The other group hears it and dismisses the whole thing on the spot, as if the only sensible response to myth is polite academic distance followed by a quick change of subject. Neither reaction is especially satisfying, and both can cause us to miss something important. Because now and then, when you listen carefully, some myths do begin to sound less like pure invention and more like memory that has been handled by many generations. Not exact memory, not transcript-level accuracy, not a tidy archive disguised as folklore, but memory all the same. Memory that has been compressed, dramatized, moralized, and wrapped in symbolic language until it no longer looks like a report, yet still carries traces of real landscapes, real dangers, and real experiences. And if that is true, even occasionally, then some of the oldest stories people told about floods, darkness, vanished lands, strange skies, or wandering ancestors may deserve a little more patience than they were often given. For a long time, modern scholarship preferred a clean division. History belonged to texts, inscriptions, official records, dates, and things that could be checked against other things with footnotes standing at attention. Myth belonged to religion, imagination, identity, poetry, and the unruly habits of oral tradition. That division was useful in some respects because myths are not simple documents. They change, they absorb motifs, they travel between cultures. They are told for many reasons besides preservation of fact. A flood story may teach humility, morality, divine justice, social order, or ritual meaning as much as anything else. A tale of ancestral migration may establish legitimacy, territory, kinship, or sacred geography. If one treats myths as literal newspaper reports, one quickly ends up in very silly places indeed. And yet the opposite mistake is to assume that because a story is not literal, it contains no memory at all. Humans are storytelling animals. Before writing, stories were one of the main ways information survived across generations. That information was not always separated into the categories we now prefer. Practical knowledge, sacred significance, historical recollection, social law, ecological warning, and moral teaching could all live in the same narrative body. A tale about a serpent beneath a river might not merely explain a ritual. It might also encode where not to camp in flood season. A story about an ancestral crossing may not only mark identity, it may preserve movement through a real corridor long altered or lost. A legend of fire from the mountain may sound supernatural to later listeners and still be rooted in a remembered eruption. This is where things become especially interesting for the story of human origins. Because once we accept that landscapes have vanished beneath sea, sand, and ice, we have to ask what happened to the memory of those changes. People do not simply watch coastlines drown or lakes disappear and forget. They ritualize loss. They explain strange transformations to children who did not see the earlier world. A flooded plain becomes a story. A vanished island becomes an ancestral place no longer reachable. A migration forced by drought becomes a remembered journey. Over time, these accounts accumulate symbolism and reshaping, but the core experience may remain surprisingly stubborn. Flood myths are the obvious example, perhaps too obvious, which is why they are often mishandled. It is tempting to take the many flood stories found across cultures and declare them proof of one single global catastrophe remembered everywhere. That sort of claim has a dramatic ring to it and a disappointing relationship with evidence. Floods are common in human life. River floods, coastal surges, tsunamis, seasonal inundation, lake overflows, and sudden storm events happen in many places. Societies living near water will naturally develop stories about destructive water. So the mere existence of flood myths proves very little on its own. It would be absurd to say otherwise. Humans also tell stories about fire, family conflict, tricksters, and people making poor decisions. One does not need a lost global empire to explain those. Still, some flood traditions may preserve local or regional environmental memory in ways more grounded than older scholars assumed. In parts of Australia, for example, there has been serious interest in the possibility that some indigenous oral traditions preserve memory of sea level rise and coastal transformation dating back thousands of years. This is an extraordinary possibility, though one must handle it with care. Oral traditions are living things, not museum jars, and they should not be raided simply to confirm modern scientific curiosity. But if stories passed down over long periods describe coastal plains now submerged, former shorelines, or transformations consistent with post-glacial flooding, then one begins to see how myth and memory might overlap. Not because the stories are frozen records, but because repeated telling can carry knowledge attached to place far longer than once believed. And place is the key. Myths detached from place can float freely and become almost infinitely interpretable, which is great for literature and terrible for careful historical reasoning. But myths rooted in particular landscapes are different. If a community says a certain reef was once dry land, or a bay was once a valley, or spirits traveled along a route now underwater, and geological evidence shows that such a transformation really occurred within the time scale of human habitation, then the story becomes more than decorative imagination. It becomes part of a longer cultural engagement with a changing world. That does not mean every detail is factual. It means the narrative may carry a memory of environmental reality expressed in cultural language. This matters because the old tendency to dismiss oral tradition often reflected more than methodological caution. It reflected a bias toward written cultures and formal records. Literate societies, especially those with long traditions of archival preservation, have often assumed that non-literate or orally organized societies must have weak historical memory. That assumption is deeply questionable. Oral societies may preserve knowledge differently but not necessarily less seriously. Repetition, performance, sacred authority, ritual context, and deep attachment to land can all stabilize narratives across long spans of time. The content may shift, of course. It always does. But written history shifts too. Chronicles exaggerate. Court records omitted. Inscriptions flatter rulers. Written documents are not pure truth simply because they are written with excellent penmanship. In fact, if one is being honest, myths may sometimes preserve kinds of memory that official written records neglect completely. A king's inscription may tell you whom he conquered or claims to have conquered, which is not always the same thing. A myth may tell you that the river moved, that the sky darkened, that the old homeland was lost, that the ancestors crossed from another place, or that the world changed in a way demanding moral and social adaptation. One is not better in every sense than the other. They preserve different kinds of truth, filtered through different priorities. There are examples from many parts of the world where stories once treated as purely fanciful later came to look more intriguing in light of geology or archaeology. Traditions surrounding ancient eruptions, earthquake zones, or unusual landforms can sometimes preserve a sense of past events, even if transformed into the language of spirits, gods, or cosmic struggle. Volcanic eruptions, in particular, are memorable in the worst possible way. They alter skies, destroy settlements, reshape terrain, and produce experiences no one present is likely to forget. It would be stranger if such events left no narrative imprint than if they did. The real question is not whether myths can preserve memory, but under what conditions, in what forms, and with what degree of reliability. Reliability, of course, is where everyone starts fidgeting, and quite right too. Because there is always a risk that once we permit myths into the discussion, every enthusiastic claim begins to sound plausible simply because it sounds ancient. This is where discipline matters. Not all stories preserve historical or environmental memory. Some are symbolic constructions with no need for a real event behind them. Some are combinations of older motifs. Some travel across large areas and are reattached to new places. Some are created relatively recently and then presented as immemorial. Humans are perfectly capable of inventing entirely new stories. We do it all the time, sometimes with alarming confidence. So the question is never, is this myth true? The better question. Is this tradition appear to preserve information consistent with independent evidence? And if so, what kind? That distinction helps keep the conversation grounded. Suppose a community tells a long-standing story of land extending beyond the current coast, of pathways or ancestral sites now beneath the sea. And marine or geological evidence indicates that the region did indeed experience submergence within the time frame of human occupation. That is worth taking seriously. Suppose another story describes a mountain exploding, darkness covering the sky, and migration from the area, and geological work confirms a major eruption with human impact. Again, worth taking seriously. But suppose someone claims that a story of sky beings obviously refers to astronauts, or that a universal flood myth proves one single event covering the whole planet at once. At that point, the careful work has usually packed its bags and left quietly through the back door. The most interesting cases are often the modest ones, not grand revelations, but local alignments between story and environment. A river once flowed here. There was fresh water there. This island was larger. The shoreline was farther out. There was a place of the old people now lost. Such memories may sound small, but small memories can matter enormously when reconstructing the deep human past. They suggest continuity of attention to landscape across very long durations. They suggest that oral cultures can function as repositories of ecological and geographical knowledge, not merely as vessels of symbolic entertainment. And they suggest that when landscapes changed dramatically after the last ice age, people may have preserved those changes in narrative long after the physical reference became inaccessible. There is also the matter of ancestral migration stories, which are nearly universal in one form or another. Again, caution is essential. Origin stories often serve social and political functions. They tell people who belongs, who came from where, what rights attach to land, how kinship works, and how the group understands itself. That means they can simplify, elevate, or reshape the past according to present needs. Yet that does not mean they are empty. A migration tradition may compress centuries into one journey, collapse multiple groups into one heroic ancestor, or translate complex movement into a sacred route. Even so, it may still preserve the fact of movement, directionality, remembered landmarks, or old places of significance. When archaeology and genetics later show unexpected patterns of mobility, such stories can start to sound less like decorative self-invention and more like culturally transformed historical memory. One reason this matters so much for our origins is that written history begins late, very late, compared with the span of human existence. The overwhelming majority of human experience was oral. If we treat oral tradition as inherently useless for recovering deep patterns of environmental and social memory, we are effectively declaring that most of humanity had no serious way of preserving the meaningful features of its own past. That seems not only arrogant but unlikely. Humans everywhere care about ancestry, movement, place, and disaster. These are exactly the kinds of things one would expect to survive in story, albeit in altered form. There is a psychological reason myths sound so strange to modern ears, even when they may carry memory. Modern educated societies are trained to divide truth into categories. Factual truth here, metaphor there, religion somewhere else, history in a separate filing cabinet, and environmental observation under another heading entirely. Traditional stories are often not arranged that way. They can be multiple things at once. A flood can be a real remembered flood, a moral lesson, a sacred reset, a cosmological statement, and a territorial marker all together. We find that untidy because we like our shelves labeled. Story does not care about our shelves. It was built to survive transmission, not to satisfy a modern grant proposal. This is why listening to myth requires a slightly different kind of discipline than excavating a wall or sequencing a tooth. One has to respect the story as a cultural form without flattening it into data. One also has to avoid the opposite mistake of wrapping it in such reverence that no empirical question can be asked of it at all. The best approach, difficult though it is, lies somewhere in the middle. Listen carefully, attend to place, compare with independent evidence, ask what sort of memory a tradition might preserve and what sort it plainly does not. And accept that in some cases the answer will remain uncertain. Uncertainty is not failure. It is simply what happens when the past has been carried in human voices rather than filed in climate-controlled cabinets. There is another reason myths may matter here. They preserve not just events but emotional structure. A story about flood, fire, darkness, wandering, exile, or the founding of a new homeland tells us something about how people experience change. The archaeological record may show that sea level rose, or a region dried, or an eruption occurred. Myth may tell us that such changes were felt as rupture, punishment, renewal, displacement, or transformation. That may not give us a date or a precise contour line, but it does give us access to human meaning. And origins are never only about chronology. They are also about how people understood where they came from, what had been lost, and why the world was the way it was. This can be especially revealing when considering catastrophic change near the end of the Ice Age and the early Holocene. As climates shifted and environments transformed, human groups were not merely adjusting subsistence strategies on a graph. They were living through upheavals. Coasts moved, wetlands vanished. Old routes failed, animals changed range. Water sources appeared and disappeared. In such conditions, the stories people told about the world would almost certainly change as well. Some stories would explain new dangers, some would preserve old places. Some would teach resilience, some would cast environmental change in moral or sacred terms. Because that is how communities make unbearable transformation livable. The deeper one thinks about this, the less surprising it becomes that myths sometimes sound like memories. What would be surprising is the opposite. It would be surprising if thousands of years of repeated storytelling across landscapes did not preserve any real trace of lived environmental experience. The challenge is not proving that myths are empty. The challenge is distinguishing where and how memory survives within them. And once that door opens, another one follows close behind. If myths can preserve traces of drowned lands, migrations, eruptions, droughts, and transformed worlds, then they may also hint at a deeper truth that archaeology and geology are uncovering from another direction. The human past may have been punctuated more often than we like to imagine by disruption severe enough to erase settlements, sever continuity, and force survivors to begin again with only a part of what came before. In that case, stories of destruction and renewal may not merely decorate the human imagination. They may be among the cultural shadows cast by repeated resets. One of the strangest things about the story of human origins is that the deeper the science goes, the more delicate it becomes. From a distance, reconstruction of the past can look wonderfully solid. There are fossils in glass cases, timelines on museum walls, maps with arrows sweeping across continents, confident documentary voices informing you that this happened here, then that happened there, and eventually everyone ended up inventing either agriculture or paperwork, depending on how generous the narrator is feeling. It all gives the impression of a completed puzzle, but if you step closer, the edges start to tremble. Because the science of reconstructing the past is not built on full landscapes, full records, and tidy explanations. It is built on fragments, absences, damaged traces, difficult methods, competing interpretations, and the uncomfortable fact that the evidence we most want is often the evidence that has vanished. This does not make the science weak. In many ways, it makes it remarkable. The real wonder is not that it occasionally changes its mind. The wonder is that from so little it can infer so much. Give a skilled team a few teeth, some pollen, a layer of ash, stone tools, and a patch of stained soil. And before long they may be telling you about diet, movement, climate, chronology, burial practice, mobility, seasonal use of the site, and whether this particular group of ancient humans preferred one kind of raw material over another. That is not guesswork in the careless sense. It is disciplined inference. But inference, however disciplined, is still vulnerable. It depends on context. It depends on preservation. It depends on method. And when any one of those becomes unstable, the whole story can shift in surprisingly large ways. This is one reason public discussions of the deep past often become slightly distorted. People tend to hear scientific conclusions as though they were carved into stone. Then when a date changes, a classification is revised, or an old model is replaced, they assume science is confused, unreliable, or involved in some grand plot to keep changing the answer out of spite. In reality, revision is exactly what one should expect in a field working with incomplete evidence and improving tools. The past is not changing. Our angle on it is, and sometimes the angle changes a great deal when a better method comes along and politely informs a century of scholarship that it may have been a bit too confident. Consider dating, which sounds straightforward until one actually looks at how it works. People love dates. They love the comfort of a number. If you say a site is around 12,000 years old, everyone nods as though the matter has been settled with the firmness of a trained timetable. But dates are not divine gifts descending neatly onto excavation forms. They come through methods, and methods have assumptions, limits, contamination risks, calibration issues, and margins of error. Radiocarbon dating, for example, transformed archaeology. But it measures the decay of carbon in formerly living material, not the age of a civilization in some broad dramatic sense. It dates a particular organic sample. That sample must be securely associated with the human activity in question. It must not have been disturbed. It must not be contaminated. It must then be calibrated against known fluctuations in atmospheric carbon. If one of those pieces slips, the story built on the date may slip with it. That does not mean radiocarbon dating is unreliable. It means it must be used carefully, interpreted carefully, and connected carefully to context. A bit of charcoal in a layer may date the burning of wood older than the activity around it. A shell may be affected by reservoir effects. Intrusive material may end up in older sediment. Burrows, roots, erosion, and water movement can rearrange deposits in ways ancient people never intended and modern archaeologists deeply resent. A site is not a neat layer cake waiting to be sliced with confidence. More often it is a trifle someone has carried across a field in bad weather. Other dating methods come with their own strengths and difficulties. Luminescence dating can estimate when sediments or objects were last exposed to light or heat. Uranium series methods can help date bones, teeth, and mineral formations. Tephrochronology can connect volcanic ash layers across regions. Paleomagnetic methods can track reversals in Earth's magnetic field. Dendrochronology can anchor events through tree rings where wood survives and sequences overlap. Each method opens windows. Each also requires conditions, assumptions, and expertise. When several methods align, confidence grows. When they disagree, things become interesting in exactly the sort of way that makes headlines, arguments, and occasionally very long conference coffee breaks. The fragility of the science does not stop at dating. Context is just as important, and context is both precious and easy to damage. A fossil or artifact without clear context is dramatically less informative than one found in secure association with surrounding material, sediment, fauna, and features. This is why looting is such a disaster for archaeology. To an outsider, removing a beautiful object may look like rescuing treasure from the ground. To science, it is often the destruction of an information network. Where exactly was the object? At what depth? In what layer? Near what bones, tools, or plant remains? Was it in a burial, a pit, a hearth, a dwelling surface, a disturbed fill? Lose that context and the object becomes far less able to speak. Even in proper excavation, context can be tricky. Layers may be mixed. Sites may have been reoccupied repeatedly over thousands of years. A cave floor can accumulate material from many different periods. Later activity can cut into earlier deposits. Natural events can move items from one level to another. A stone tool found in a layer does not always mean it was made or used exactly when that layer formed. A bone can be redeposited. A hearth can be disturbed. An animal can carry material. Water can rearrange a site so thoroughly that the neat chronological order archaeologists dream about has long since dissolved into a sort of sedimentary practical joke. Then there is the challenge of classification, which is never as simple as the diagram suggests. Fossils are often incomplete. A jaw here, a few teeth there, perhaps part of a skull, perhaps a limb bone if everyone is having an unusually good season. From that, paleoanthropologists must decide whether the remains belong to a known species, a regional variation, a new population, or a category that may later be revised entirely. The temptation to fit fragmentary evidence into existing boxes is strong, partly because some boxes need it, and partly because humans like labels the way old drawers like brass handles. But evolution does not always produce tidy boxes. It produces variation, mosaics, local populations, overlapping traits, and long periods of change that do not announce where one category ends and another begins. This is especially true with hominins. One specimen may look more archaic in one feature and more derived in another. Another may be too incomplete to classify with confidence but too intriguing to ignore. Should it be called a new species, a local population, part of a broader lineage? Scientists disagree, sometimes vigorously, because the evidence really does allow more than one reasonable interpretation. To the public, disagreement can look like uncertainty in the embarrassing sense. In reality, it is often uncertainty in the honest sense. The fossil record is sparse, and the people working on it know exactly how much is missing. Ancient DNA has made reconstruction both stronger and more fragile at the same time. Stronger because it can reveal relationships impossible to see from bones alone. Fragile because it is extremely vulnerable to contamination, preservation limits, and overinterpretation. Ancient DNA work requires extraordinary care. Human handlers, laboratory conditions, environmental contamination, degraded molecules, and tiny sample sizes all pose risks. The dream is to extract usable genetic information from the deep past and compare it across populations. The reality is that success depends on preservation conditions so specific that whole regions remain frustratingly underrepresented. Cold environments often preserve DNA better. Hot, humid ones tend to be Less generous. That means our genetic map of the past is partly a map of where molecules happen to survive. And even when the DNA survives, interpretation is not simple. Genetic ancestry is not identical to culture, language, identity, or material tradition. A population may adopt a new style without major genetic replacement. Another may contribute genes to a region with relatively subtle archaeological visibility. Population models are statistical constructions. They reveal patterns of mixture, divergence, relatedness, and movement, but they do not read minds or recover self-understanding. The people whose genomes are sampled did not label themselves with our categories, nor did they know they would one day become points in a PCA plot, while modern researchers argue over whether the signal suggests one migration pulse or three. Archaeology and genetics, then, are powerful but not self-sufficient. They must be combined with climate science, geology, paleoecology, isotope analysis, zooarchaeology, and all the other tools that help reconstruct ancient worlds. This is where the science becomes even more fragile, because interdisciplinary work is enormously productive and occasionally chaotic. Different kinds of evidence do not always resolve into one clean story. Climate records may suggest one period of openness or stress. Archaeology may reveal settlement patterns that partly fit and partly complicate that climate picture. Genetics may show movement but not necessarily motive. Oral traditions may preserve memory but not in a form easy to date. Each line of evidence illuminates a different aspect of the past. The challenge is not simply collecting them, it is getting them to speak to one another without forcing them into a premature agreement. One of the more underappreciated difficulties is scale. The deep past operates across scales that do not sit comfortably together. A hearth may record a single event. A burial may reflect one community's practice. A climate proxy may summarize centuries. A genetic pattern may reflect many generations of mixture. A migration model may describe movements over thousands of years. Try to combine them all and one quickly sees the problem. What looks like contradiction is sometimes only a mismatch of scale. A local site may reveal continuity while broader genetics suggest regional turnover. A climatic shift may open a corridor, but not every group uses it at once. A tool tradition may persist while the people carrying it change. The reconstruction of the past is fragile, partly because evidence is always arriving at different resolutions. The human factor matters too. Science is done by people, and people come with training, expectations, incentives, loyalties, habits, and the occasional fondness for being right in public. None of this makes the enterprise invalid. It simply makes it human. Researchers build careers around models. Disciplines develop preferences. Certain interpretations become dominant because they are elegant, because they fit existing frameworks, or because they come from influential institutions. Other interpretations wait longer for acceptance. Not always because they are wrong, but because science, like any other social activity, has inertia. It moves, but not instantly. A persuasive new model requires evidence, repetition, critique, and time. Media coverage adds another layer of fragility, usually by trying to simplify things into something that can be turned into a title involving the phrase, "everything we thought we knew." The public has often served a dramatic before and after narrative in which an entire field was confidently wrong on Tuesday and gloriously corrected by Thursday afternoon. That makes for good headlines. It makes for a poor understanding of how knowledge actually changes. Most revisions are not total reversals. They are refinements, expansions, regional corrections, or serious complications to a previously useful but incomplete model. The science is fragile not because it is flimsy, but because it must hold together a large number of provisional, conditional, revisable claims without pretending they are all eternal truth. There is also the problem of absence, which may be the greatest fragility of all. Much of the past simply has not survived. Organic materials vanish, wooden structures rot, textiles disappear, coastlines drown, sediments erode, small camps leave faint traces, entire landscapes become inaccessible. We often reconstruct human life from what is durable rather than what was central. Stone tools survive better than woven bags. Bones survive better than songs. Hearths survive better than social roles. This gives the archaeological record an unavoidable bias towards certain kinds of evidence. One can infer around that bias but not fully escape it. This matters especially when talking about cognition, belief, symbolism, and social life. These are things people desperately want to locate in the past with precision. When did language emerge? Religion? Myth? Abstract thought? Complex social structures. The scientific answer is often less satisfying than the audience hopes. We infer such things indirectly through burials, pigments, ornamentation, spatial organization, long-distance exchange, standardization, cooperative construction, and repeated symbolic motifs. These are meaningful clues. They are not direct transcripts of thought. Fragility here lies in the leap from material trace to mental world. We can make the leap, but we must make it carefully. Take a burial with red ochre and grave goods. It may suggest ritual significance, personhood, symbolism, perhaps beliefs regarding death. Those are serious inferences, but the exact content of the belief system remains beyond recovery. A cave painting may reveal symbolic representation, teaching, ritual, aesthetic life, territorial marking, or all of the above. A monumental enclosure may indicate coordinated labor and shared meaning, but not necessarily priesthood in the later formal sense. Archaeology can show complexity without always telling us how the people involved would have described it. That gap matters because modern minds are very quick to fill silence with familiar categories. And yet, for all this fragility, the science works. It works not by pretending to certainty it does not have, but by layering independent lines of evidence until some possibilities become more plausible than others. A data line with a stratigraphic sequence. Isotope data support mobility. Genetics reveal mixture. Sediment analysis confirms local conditions. Tool assemblages show continuity or change. One line alone may be weak. Together they can be compelling. Reconstruction is fragile in each component and resilient in combination, which is rather like many human achievements when one thinks about it. A good example of this layered resilience is the shift in understanding around Neanderthals and other ancient humans. It was not one find that changed the story. It was fossils, wear patterns on teeth, injury evidence, tools, cave use, pigments, ornaments, ancient DNA, and increasingly refined chronologies all accumulating over time. Each piece by itself might not have overturned the stereotype. Together, they made the stereotype impossible to defend. This is how the science of the past tends to advance. Less like a trumpet blast, more like a wall slowly giving way because too many carefully documented facts are leaning against it. There is something almost philosophical about this. We want the past to be firm because origins feel important. We want to know who we are, where we came from, and how the sequence unfolded. But the science that serves those desires can only operate by acknowledging uncertainty. It must say, this is our best reconstruction for now. It must allow for new data. It must tolerate incomplete answers. It must sometimes stand in front of the public and admit that what looked obvious a decade ago now looks less obvious. That is not weakness. It is discipline under difficult conditions. It is also why claims of absolute certainty about remote human origins should always make us a little wary. Not because nothing can be known, but because what is known sits atop a scaffold of method, preservation, context, and interpretation. The farther back we go, the more that scaffold matters. A single new cave, a new method of extracting degraded DNA, a submerged site, a revised date, a pollen core from the right basin, or a better model of ancient climate can shift a great deal. The deeper story remains real, but our hold on it is never as final as museum captions like to imply. Once you really absorb that, a curious possibility begins to seem less outrageous than it first sounded. If reconstructing the past is this delicate, if our models depend on fragmentary evidence and changing methods, then some of the largest assumptions we inherited about one place, one people, or one clean beginning may not survive scrutiny in the form we received them. The origin of humanity may not have been a single spotlight coming up on one stage. It may have been more like many lights in a shifting landscape, brightening, dimming, and overlapping long before anyone thought to call it a beginning. There is a comforting simplicity in the idea that humanity began once. One place, one population, one clean emergence, and from that single beginning the rest of the story unfolds. It has a satisfying shape to it. You can imagine a map perhaps with one glowing point somewhere in Africa, arrows gently radiating outward, and eventually the whole world filling with descendants of that first unmistakably human group. It is neat. It is teachable. It fits very nicely on educational posters and in documentaries where everyone has excellent lighting and the past behaves itself for the duration of the episode. The difficulty, as we have been discovering, is that the real past rarely behaves with such courtesy. The deeper the evidence becomes, the more awkwardly the old simplicity starts to sit. Not because the broad picture is wrong in every respect. There is still very strong evidence that our species, Homo sapiens, has its deepest roots in Africa. That remains one of the central foundations of modern paleoanthropology. But the question becomes more subtle and also much more interesting when we stop asking where humanity began as though it were one clean instant and start asking what exactly we mean by began. Do we mean the first appearance of our species as a biological population? The first emergence of recognizably modern anatomy? The first appearance of symbolic behavior, long-distance exchange, or complex social thought. The first time different human groups came together in a way that produced what we would later call us. And once those questions are separated, the tidy single beginning begins to look more like a stack of different beginnings, all slightly out of step with one another. That is where the unsettling possibility enters. What if humanity in the meaningful sense did not begin once in one simple event? What if it emerged more than once, or rather in more than one place, through more than one population, with different traits appearing at different times and later blending together, not separate human creations in the dramatic mythical sense, and not entirely independent origins? Of our species springing up all over the map like mushrooms after rain, that would be too easy. The evidence does not support that kind of free-for-all, but a more distributed origin, a braided emergence, a repeated assembly of what we later identify as human modernity. That is a much more serious possibility. The problem begins with our habit of imagining species boundaries as clean and decisive. We like the idea that at some particular point there was a not quite human population, and then suddenly, or at least recognizably, there was a fully modern one. Nature is usually less theatrical than that. Evolution works through populations, variation, selection, drift, isolation, contact, and time. It does not issue opening night announcements. A new species does not appear one morning, stretch a little and say, "Well then, I suppose I am Homo sapiens now." Instead, traits accumulate unevenly across populations. Faces change, skulls change, behavior shifts, populations separate and reconnect. Some features that later seem defining may appear early in one group and later in another. The thing we call a species is often the product of many generations of gradual difference, not one dramatic threshold. This makes the origin of Homo sapiens difficult to pin down in the way people often want. Fossils from Africa show a range of traits across time and region. Some early specimens look quite modern in some respects and more archaic in others. One skull may have a face that seems recognizably like ours, while the brain case retains older proportions. Another may show a different blend. If we insist on asking which fossil is the first real human, we may be asking the wrong question. It may be more accurate to say that the package of features we associate with our species assembled over time across several populations in different ecological settings, and that these populations were not necessarily isolated from one another in any simple way. That is one of the reasons the idea of a Pan-African origin has become so important in recent discussions. Instead of imagining one tiny birthplace producing all modern humans in a single local burst, some researchers suggest that our species emerged across a structured network of populations distributed through different parts of Africa. These groups may have been separated at times by deserts, forests, rivers, climate shifts, and distance, then reconnected during wetter or more favorable periods. They would have exchanged genes, ideas, and adaptive traits over long time scales. In such a model, no single region alone contains the whole secret of our beginnings. Humanity as a biological and behavioral pattern would have been assembled through interaction among multiple populations, rather than born complete in one isolated cradle. There is something almost embarrassingly fitting about that. Humans are social, mobile, and inclined toward mixture. Why should the origin of our species have been the one moment in our history that behaved with complete neatness and stayed in one place? A distributed emergence is less tidy, but it feels more like the kind of process evolution would actually produce. It also explains why fossils from different parts of Africa can each seem important without any one specimen carrying the full burden of being the first proper human. Some may preserve early modern facial features, others may show developments in cranial shape, others may be associated with signs of symbolic behavior or tool innovation. The old wish for one beginning gives way to a more complex picture in which humanity in the full sense comes into focus gradually through population structure and contact. Then there is behavior, which complicates things further. For a long time, people like to imagine a so-called human revolution, a sharp transition in which fully modern behavior suddenly appeared, bringing with it art, symbolism, long-distance trade, complex tools, and all the other marks of mental sophistication that make us feel comfortably special. It was a dramatic idea, and for that reason alone perhaps worth distrusting. As more evidence accumulated, the story became less revolutionary and more patchy. Symbolic behavior does not seem to arrive in one neat package everywhere at once. Pigments appear in some contexts, personal ornaments in others, engraved objects here, long-distance material transport there, burials with signs of ritual care elsewhere. These traits emerge unevenly, sometimes early, sometimes intermittently, and not all in one place. That matters because if we define humanity by behavior rather than just anatomy, then the beginning becomes even harder to locate. Did humanity begin when bodies became recognizably modern? When minds became symbolic? When social networks reached a certain scale? When memory, ritual, or aesthetic expression crossed some invisible threshold? The trouble is that those capacities may not have appeared in a single synchronized burst. Different groups may have displayed different parts of what we now call modernity at different times. One population may have had advanced symbolic practice without some later anatomical proportions. Another may have had anatomical modernity with less visible material evidence for symbolism, perhaps because the evidence did not preserve. Once again, one clean beginning starts to dissolve into multiple overlapping beginnings. And then there is interbreeding, which politely ruins almost every narrative that depends on perfect separation. Modern humans did not arise, march out into the world, and encounter a planet empty of all other human populations. They met Neanderthals. Quite possibly they met other groups we do not yet know well. And they did not simply wave from a distance and continue on with admirable species purity. They mixed, not constantly, not everywhere, and not without all the complicated realities such encounters must have involved, but enough to leave enduring traces in living genomes. That means that even after Homo sapiens had emerged as a recognizable population, humanity in the broader sense was still being assembled through contact with other humans. This should make us pause over the phrase modern human. It sounds straightforward until one asks, how much of modern humanity comes from interaction with populations outside the neat line leading only through anatomically modern Homo sapiens? Some inherited traits from Neanderthals and Denisovans are associated with immunity, adaptation to altitude, skin biology, and other aspects of human variation. That does not make those populations our creators, but it does make them participants in our becoming. If pieces of what living humans are came through mixture with groups once treated as entirely separate side branches, then humanity again begins to look less like one beginning and more like repeated assembly. There is also a deeper possibility, one that is both cautious and radical at the same time. What if traits associated with modernity emerged independently more than once among different human populations, at least in partial form? Not because they were completely separate species converging magically into us, but because similar ecological and social pressures may have encouraged similar developments in different groups. Symbolic marking, cooperation beyond immediate kin, ritual treatment of the dead, planning depth, and sophisticated use of landscape may not all depend on one exclusive spark igniting in one sacred location. Some of these capacities may have roots shared more broadly among human populations. Others may have been elaborated in parallel. If so, then humanity in the meaningful cultural sense may have had several centers of intensification rather than one absolute point of origin. This becomes especially plausible when one remembers how widely distributed human relatives were and how varied their environments had become across Africa, Eurasia, and island Southeast Asia. Different populations faced very different challenges and opportunities. Some adapted to cold steppe environments, others to forests, others to coasts, islands, mountains, or shifting savannas. Such diversity of setting would naturally produce diversity of behavior and adaptation. A capacity that mattered in one region might be elaborated there earlier or differently than elsewhere. Social complexity could deepen around rich coastal zones, seasonal aggregation sites, or resource bottlenecks. Symbolic traditions could emerge in relation to local ritual landscapes. Technological innovations could spread, disappear, or reappear. The history of humanity starts to look less like one invention and more like a conversation held in many dialects. At this point, someone usually becomes nervous that such a view threatens the unity of our species. It does not. If anything, it deepens that unity by making it less dependent on one exclusionary origin point. Humanity can still be one species, one broad family, even if that family was assembled through structured populations and repeated interaction, rather than one singular event. In fact, the evidence increasingly suggests that unity came through connection, not isolation. Wet periods opened corridors. Groups moved, intermarried, shared technologies, carried stories, adapted to each other as well as to climate. The human story may have been unified not because it began as one small, perfectly sealed group, but because populations kept rejoining often enough to remain part of the same larger becoming. There is a curious irony here. Older accounts sometimes imagined the first true humans as a pure central population from which others descended. Newer evidence suggests something much more untidy and much more familiar. A species emerging from diversity, regional variation, and repeated contact. In other words, the deeper past begins to resemble the later human world rather more than expected. People moved, people mixed, people maintained local identity and broader connection at the same time. One is tempted to say that humanity began not despite this messiness, but through it. Even the phrase, "out of Africa," becomes richer and more complicated under this light. It remains a powerful and well-supported framework, but it should not be understood as a simple arrow leaving one tiny source and replacing everything in its path. Rather, it may involve multiple dispersals, partial failures, returns, regional survivals, and later pulses interacting with populations already outside Africa. Some early movements may have left little or no lasting trace. Others may have contributed indirectly. Some may have been absorbed. The world beyond Africa was not a blank canvas. Nor for that matter was Africa itself a single undifferentiated homeland. It was a continent of ecologies, barriers, corridors, and populations whose internal history may be nearly as complicated as what happened after some groups moved outward. Then there is the possibility that humanity in the sense of lived identity may have begun repeatedly within each generation. Anyway, this sounds philosophical, and perhaps it is, but it has scientific relevance. A child is not born with all the full content of human culture already installed like a very ambitious operating system. Humanity must be taught, repeated, embodied, and renewed. Language, ritual, memory, kinship, tool use, moral expectations, landscape knowledge, all these are inherited socially as much as biologically. So even if our species arose once in the biological sense, humanity as a lived condition has always been recreated again and again in every community, every family line, every migration, every rebuilding after loss. The deeper we go into origins, the more the biological and cultural stories overlap without ever fully becoming the same thing. This may help explain why there is such persistent unease around the question. We want one. Beginning because one beginning feels stable, it gives us something like a birthplace. Partial traits, repeated connections, and ongoing cultural renewal. Then our origin is less like a birth certificate and more like a long formation. That can feel slippery, even disappointing, if one had hoped for a dramatic first moment. Yet it may be truer to the evidence, and certainly truer to evolution. Complex things often emerge this way, not all at once, but through distributed assembly. One might even say that the search for one definitive beginning reflects a rather modern taste for singularity. We like founding dates. We like opening ceremonies. We like to know when the thing officially started. Nature is not especially interested in official starts. Rivers do not begin with a signpost announcing that this is now a river. Languages do not wake up one morning fully formed, and humanity in all likelihood did not begin with a single clean scene either. It gathered itself. It spread through bodies and behaviors. It formed in mosaics. It was refined through contact. It survived in multiple populations before later histories narrowed our imagination of what once existed. There is another consequence of all this. If humanity did begin more than once, in the sense of repeated emergence across populations and places, then loss becomes just as important as origin. Some experiments in being human flourished and vanished. Some symbolic worlds may have been created and lost. Some lines of ancestry contributed only faintly to the present. Some populations carried adaptations or social structures that later disappeared. The modern human world is not the total record of what humanity has been. It is what survived. That is a very different and more humbling thought. It means our existence is not simply the unfolding of the best version of humanity, but the residue of many interactions, extinctions, mixtures, and chances. And once you let that thought settle for a moment, another one follows. If our species emerged through repeated contact and assembly, and if the behavioral world we call human may have intensified in several places rather than one, then the disasters and disruptions that punctuated prehistory may have done more than simply challenge already formed societies. They may have erased entire versions of what humanity had once been, leaving only fragments, echoes, and survivors to begin again under altered skies. There is a persistent habit in the way we imagine the human past. We picture progress as something steady, slow perhaps, sometimes uneven, but basically cumulative. One generation learns a little, the next keeps it, adds to it, and hands the improved version onward. Villages become towns, towns become cities, ideas accumulate, tools improve, memory deepens, and civilization in this comfortable view rises like bread in a well-behaved oven. It is an appealing picture, partly because it allows us to feel that the road behind us was leading somewhere, and partly because it suggests that once humanity learned something important, it mostly stayed learned. The problem is that real history, especially prehistory, may have been interrupted far more often than this story allows. Not interrupted in the mild sense of a bad harvest or a local war, but in the harsher sense of climatic shock, flood, drought, eruption, ecological collapse, regional depopulation, migration, fragmentation, and the sudden failure of the ordinary conditions that make knowledge easy to preserve. In such moments, a society does not simply lose comfort, it can lose continuity, and continuity is far more fragile than we like to think. A technique survives only if enough people still practice it. A story survives only if enough people keep telling it. A ritual survives only if the places, materials, and social structures that sustain it remain intact. Once catastrophe enters, all of that can begin to come apart. Surprisingly fast, this is why the phrase reset is useful, though it must be handled carefully. It does not necessarily mean that all human knowledge was wiped away in one giant dramatic event while thunder boomed and some narrator became very excited. More often it means something subtler and in many ways more realistic. A region experiences enough environmental or social disruption that previous patterns of life become impossible to maintain. Settlements are abandoned, trade routes fail, specialist knowledge is lost because the specialists die, disperse, or no longer have the resources to do what they once did. Memory shrinks to what is essential. A culture that may have been developing in one direction is forced into another. Later, people inherit fragments rather than wholes. That kind of reset may have happened many times in deep history. And if it did, then our tendency to imagine a simple upward curve of human development becomes very hard to defend. What we call origins may be shaped not only by where humanity began, but by how many times earlier experiments in human living were broken, scattered, and partially erased. Climate is perhaps the largest force in this discussion, because for most of human existence, climate was not background scenery. It was a structural condition of life, a shift in rainfall, seasonality, temperature, vegetation, coastlines, or animal distribution could alter everything from mobility to diet, from settlement to ritual, from kinship obligations to conflict. During the late Pleistocene and early Holocene especially, humans lived through a world in motion. Ice sheets retreated, sea levels rose, river systems changed, grasslands spread then shrank. Fertile corridors opened and closed. Lakes expanded and vanished. This was not a stable platform upon which an orderly march towards civilization took place. It was a moving landscape that repeatedly asked human groups to adapt or disappear. The Younger Dryas is one of the most frequently discussed examples, and with good reason. Around the end of the last ice age, after a period of warming, parts of the northern hemisphere experienced an abrupt return to much colder conditions. The causes are still debated in detail, as serious scientific matters tend to be, especially when they involve large systems behaving badly. What matters here is that it represented a major climatic disruption. Environments shifted sharply, resources changed, habitable zones altered. For human communities already adapting to post-glacial transformation, this was not a minor inconvenience. It would have affected food availability, movement, settlement patterns, and social organization across broad areas. Now, one must resist the temptation to turn every large climatic event into a universal civilization destroyer of the more theatrical sort. That is not what the evidence supports. Different regions were affected differently. Some groups adapted, others moved, some intensified certain practices, some likely suffered severely. But the broader point stands. If a climatic swing of this scale occurs while human societies are experimenting with new forms of settlement, resource management, ritual aggregation, or early cultivation, then it can interrupt trajectories we later treat as inevitable. A society beginning to settle more permanently may be pushed back into mobility. A productive region may become unreliable. Social ties may stretch under pressure. New forms of cooperation may arise, but old ones may break. This is one reason catastrophe need not only destroy, it can also reorganize. Hardship can force innovation, concentration, migration, and social change. Yet even when something new emerges from disruption, continuity may still be broken. The post-catastrophe world is not simply the pre-catastrophe world with an added lesson. It is a different arrangement of people, resources, memory, and possibility. Later, archaeologists may see continuity in some tools. Some symbols, some sites, but under the surface, a great deal may have been lost. Sea level rise after the last ice age presents another kind of reset. Less sudden in many places, but relentless on a human timescale. As the great ice sheets melted, coastlines moved inland. Sometimes gradually, sometimes in pulses, sometimes accompanied by regional flooding, erosion, and ecological change. For communities living on coastal plains, estuaries, river mouths, and continental shelves, this would not have been an abstract geological trend. It would have been lived experience. Campsites vanished, shorelines retreated, freshwater sources were altered, fishing grounds came. Paths and gathering places were lost. The dead may have been left behind as the land itself disappeared. Entire landscapes that had structured identity and memory could become unreachable. It is difficult to overstate how disruptive that can be. We tend to imagine migration as people choosing a new location and carrying their culture with them intact, like a family moving house with perhaps too many boxes and one regrettable lamp. Real displacement is harsher than that. When people lose a homeland to water, they lose more than physical ground. They lose orientation, sacred geography, stored knowledge attached to place, and the ordinary routes through which generations learned how to live. Some knowledge can travel, some cannot. A fishing tradition tied to a drowned estuary does not transfer neatly to an inland plain. Rituals tied to ancestral stones or shoreline caves may become impossible. What survives may be memory, song, story, or fragments of practice, but the whole world that sustained them is gone. And that loss is archaeologically deceptive, because drowned worlds do not merely suffer catastrophe, they are hidden from us afterward. A coastal culture repeatedly displaced by rising seas may leave far less accessible evidence than a later inland settlement built on higher ground. The archaeology that survives may therefore make it look as though the later group was the more significant beginning, when in fact it may be the survivor of a long period of loss and adaptation whose earlier stages now lie underwater. Volcanic catastrophes raise similar questions, though in a more explosive mood. Major eruptions can devastate local and regional environments, darken skies, alter climate temporarily, poison water, destroy vegetation, and force movement on a large scale. The Toba eruption, which occurred roughly 74,000 years ago in what is now Indonesia, has long attracted enormous attention because it was one of the largest eruptions in the Quaternary. For a while, there was strong enthusiasm for the idea that it nearly wiped out humanity, creating a severe population bottleneck from which all later humans descended. That scenario, in its darkest form, has become less secure as more evidence has accumulated. Human populations appear to have been more resilient and regionally varied in their response than the most dramatic versions allowed. Still, even if Toba did not reduce humanity to one anxious family in a cave staring at ash, it remains a reminder of scale. Large eruptions can create regional or wider disruptions serious enough to reshape populations and pathways of survival. And Toba is only one example. Smaller but still devastating eruptions throughout prehistory could have erased settlements, forced migration, severed networks, and turned habitable zones into dangerous ground. The effect of such events would depend on where people lived, how mobile they were, what fallback strategies they possessed, and whether neighboring populations could absorb them. But one does not need a species-wide apocalypse for catastrophe to matter profoundly. A regional reset can be enough to break continuity in a way the later record barely captures. Then there are droughts, which have a quieter reputation than floods and eruptions, though they can be every bit as brutal. Water scarcity changes everything. It changes where people can live, how animals move, what plants survive, how far groups travel, and how often they come into conflict. Repeated or extended drought can empty landscapes, fragment communities, force technological changes, and favor entirely different social arrangements than those that existed under wetter conditions. Regions that once supported dense occupation can become impossible. Ritual centers can be abandoned. Trade and seasonal aggregation can collapse. Knowledge associated with older ecological conditions can become useless in the new reality, which is a deeply efficient way for a culture to lose part of itself without any invader needing to lift a finger. The greening and drying cycles of the Sahara are instructive here. During wetter periods, large areas were habitable, with lakes, grasslands, animals, and human communities distributed across what is now a vast, arid zone. When aridity returned, those worlds did not simply adjust a little. They were transformed. People moved. Populations compressed into refugia or shifted into other regions. Ways of life tied to lakes, pastures, and routes across open grassland became unsustainable. That is a reset. Not because all humanity forgot everything at once, but because one whole environmental matrix of human life closed down. The archaeology of what came before becomes hard to recover, and later distributions can make the earlier connectivity difficult to imagine. Storms, tsunamis, glacial lake outbursts, and abrupt regional floods deserve mention too. Prehistoric people were vulnerable to local disasters on a scale that could erase settlements and social memory with ruthless efficiency. A river changing course can destroy the core of a community. A glacial outburst flood can transform a valley beyond recognition. A tsunami can strip a coastline of life and material culture in hours. If one wants to know why some promising developments in the archaeological record do not appear to continue smoothly, catastrophe is often a better explanation than any fanciful claim about ancient incompetence. People do not fail to build on their achievements because they lack intelligence. Often they fail because the world they built in is taken away. This is also where the seductive idea of lost advanced civilization needs careful handling. Catastrophe talk attracts exaggeration as jam attracts wasps. Once people accept that the past contained major disruptions, then they can begin to understand the nature of the problem. They are tempted to imagine entire high civilizations erased without trace, complete with observatories, metalworking, and perhaps surprisingly tasteful stone furniture. That kind of leap is understandable but usually unsupported. The more grounded possibility is more subtle and, I think, more compelling. Not that there was one forgotten global super-civilization, but that there were many local and regional worlds of considerable sophistication whose continuity was broken before they could leave the kinds of durable records we associate with later states. Sophistication need not mean writing, bronze, and formal kingship. It can mean deep environmental knowledge, ritual complexity, seasonal aggregation, long-distance exchange, architecture in perishable materials, social hierarchies not yet formalized in palaces, and oral traditions capable of preserving meaning across many generations. Such societies could be highly organized and still remain archaeologically vulnerable. Let one or two severe climatic or hydrological shocks strike those systems, followed by migration and dispersal, and much of what they knew may survive only in fragments, transformed customs, or stories whose original references are gone. That is perhaps the most important point here. Catastrophe does not need to erase all people to erase a world. It only needs to break enough of the links that carry continuity. A ritual specialist dies without apprentices. A route can no longer be traveled. A ceremonial center floods. A crop or seasonal resource fails for too many years. Communities split and do not reunite. Children grow up in a different ecology from their parents and inherit only what still works. Within a few generations, an entire way of organizing reality can be reduced to memory, symbol, or a tale about what the ancestors once knew. Later descendants may still be fully human, fully intelligent, fully capable. They are not degraded. They are simply beginning again from a narrower surviving base. This may help explain why some archaeological sequences seem to show bursts of complexity followed by simplification, dispersal, or long pauses. The old story of progress had trouble with such patterns. It preferred a rising line. But real societies can become less materially complex under pressure while remaining cognitively and socially rich. Mobile life may replace settlement, not because people forgot how to settle, but because mobility again became the safer strategy. Monument building may cease, not because the symbolism vanished, but because the labor system supporting it collapsed. Trade objects may disappear because routes broke, not because curiosity ended. In that sense, catastrophe can flatten the visible record without flattening human capacity. There is a curious emotional consequence to taking this seriously. It makes the modern world feel less like the inevitable culmination of history, and more like one surviving branch in a landscape of many interrupted attempts. We tend to assume that whatever did not continue was somehow inferior, incomplete, or merely transitional. But catastrophe does not select only the best. It selects the luckiest, the most adaptable under particular conditions, the most mobile, the best placed geographically, or simply those not standing in the wrong valley when the water came through. Survival is not a clean moral ranking. It is contingency wearing a very stern face. This is where myths and memories of destruction begin to sound different as well. Stories of flood, darkness, wandering, and world renewal may not be literal records of one universal event, but they may encode precisely this deeper truth of human experience. That world's end. Not the planet, not humanity as a whole, but human worlds. Home territories, ecological systems, ritual centers, social arrangements, inherited certainties. And when those worlds end, survivors do what survivors always do. They preserve what they can, change what they must, and tell stories about what happened until those stories become part of the next beginning. If that happened repeatedly in prehistory, and there is every reason to think it did in one form or another, then our account of origins becomes less a tale of uninterrupted ascent and more a pattern of advances, shocks, recoveries, dispersals, and reassembly. Knowledge would not simply accumulate. It would accumulate, fracture, migrate, condense, and sometimes vanish. Whole branches of social possibility may have been pruned by catastrophe before later history ever saw them clearly. Some techniques may have been rediscovered after being lost. Some symbolic worlds may have been rebuilt on older foundations no one fully remembered. Some communities may have carried embers of earlier systems into entirely different settings and watched them flare into new forms. And once you begin to see the past that way, another question begins to press a little harder. If the human story was repeatedly reset by catastrophe, then the parts of it we now call civilization, history, and origin may depend far more on survival through disruption than on any single clean beginning. Which means that if our origins are more broken, interrupted, and reconstructed than we thought, then many of the familiar ideas built on those origins may need rethinking too. Once you begin to suspect that our origins may be less tidy than we were taught, a strange thing happens. The question stops being only about the past. It starts reaching forward into the present and tugging on all sorts of things that seemed until then comfortably settled. Because origin stories do more than explain where we came from. They quietly shape how we think about intelligence, identity, progress, civilization, belonging, memory, and even what kind of species we imagine ourselves to be. If the beginning changes, the whole structure built on that beginning can shift a little, sometimes a lot. That is why debates about origins are never just technical. Of course, there are technical parts, and many of them involve teeth, sediments, statistical models, dating methods, and the sort of arguments that make perfect sense once someone has explained them 3 times and drawn a diagram on a napkin. But beneath the technical level sits something larger. Every culture, every society, and every era tells itself a story about how humans began and what that beginning means. Sometimes the story is religious, sometimes national, sometimes scientific. Often it is a mixture of all 3, with each part pretending not to notice the others in the room. However it is framed, the story tends to carry moral weight. It tells us whether we rose steadily from simplicity into sophistication, whether civilization was inevitable, whether certain peoples were earlier or later to history, whether the modern world is the obvious destination of the human experiment, and whether the people who came before us were rough drafts or fully realized human beings living under different conditions. So if our origins are wrong, or at least wrong in the neat familiar way many people imagine them, then several favorite assumptions start to wobble. The first is the idea of progress as a straight line. This may be the biggest one. Modern societies, especially industrial ones, are very fond of the upward curve. We like charts that move in one direction. We like the feeling that history has been climbing toward us and that we are standing on the latest and therefore highest step. This habit affects how people think about everything from technology to morality to architecture. It also affects how they imagine the deep past. Early humans are placed at the beginning of a ladder. Hunter-gatherers become an opening act. Farming is the next rung. Cities come after that. Writing, state, science, and modernity follow. The whole arrangement has a satisfying shape, not unlike a school staircase built by someone with a strong belief in order. The trouble is that if our origins were distributed, interrupted, mixed, regionally varied, and repeatedly reshaped by catastrophe, then progress begins to look less like a ladder and more like a very complicated landscape. In one place, social complexity may intensify early. In another, mobility may remain the better strategy for thousands of years. One group may develop symbolic systems of great richness without cities. Another may build monuments before full agriculture. A third may lose continuity through environmental disruption and reorganize under entirely different conditions. Under that view, no single path represents the path. Humanity did not all queue politely for civilization. Different populations tried different ways of living, and some of those ways left fewer durable traces than others. That matters because the old straight-line model is often smuggled in judgments about worth. Settled life appears more advanced than mobile life. Monumental architecture appears more advanced than oral tradition. Writing appears more advanced than memory. Dense administration appears more advanced than ecological flexibility. Once those judgments are built into the origin story, later inequalities start to look natural. Some people get described as being closer to the beginning, others closer to the supposed peak. That is not just bad history. It has often been bad politics, bad anthropology, and bad manners dressed as confidence. If the origin story changes, then the ranking system weakens. A mobile, foraging society may no longer look like a relic of humanity's childhood. It may look like one durable and highly intelligent adaptation among several. A monumentless culture may no longer look unfinished. It may look like a society whose complexity was expressed in memory, ritual, kinship, and landscape knowledge rather than stone. Once that shift happens, the old equation between visible material bulk and human sophistication starts to lose its grip. This leads to a second change. Our understanding of intelligence itself becomes less arrogant. Modern people are strongly tempted to equate intelligence with the kinds of problems modernity rewards. Literacy, numeracy, formal abstraction, engineering, durable materials, bureaucratic organization, and increasingly the ability to remember passwords while pretending not to resent them. These are real skills, and some of them are impressive. But if the deeper human past was full of societies managing vast territories through memory, timing movement to ecological cycles, navigating coastlines and seasonal routes, preserving oral knowledge across generations, and adapting to changing climates without written instructions or central administration, then our definition of intelligence has been too narrow. Ancient intelligence may have been distributed differently, not absent. It may have lived in memory systems, oral training, pattern recognition, social negotiation, and sensory attention to the environment at a level many modern people would find almost unnerving. A person who can read subtle changes in animal movement, wind direction, water behavior, and plant timing across a landscape is not less intelligent than a person reading a spreadsheet under fluorescent lighting. They are solving a different problem set. Once our origins stop looking like a march out of stupidity, the old habit of underestimating ancient people becomes harder to maintain without embarrassment. A third thing changes as well, and this one is a little more personal. Identity begins to soften at the edges. Many modern communities tell origin stories that imply deep separateness. We came from here, they came from there. Our people are rooted in one line, one place, one continuity. There is comfort in such stories. They create belonging, they anchor memory. But the scientific story increasingly points toward mixture, repeated movement, contact, absorption, and long histories of populations splitting and rejoining. Even where local continuity is real, and sometimes it absolutely is, it usually exists alongside broader patterns of exchange and ancestry that are less pure than cultural mythology often prefers. That does not mean identity becomes meaningless. Far from it. Belonging is real. Place matters. Continuity matters. Cultural inheritance matters. But if our species emerged through braided populations and continues to become itself through mixture with other human groups, then purity becomes a very strange thing to worship. We are in a deep sense a mixed species. Our beginnings do not support fantasies of untouched separation. If anything, they support the opposite lesson, that connection, movement, and interaction were central to what made us. This has ethical consequences. It becomes harder to justify hierarchies built on myths of pristine descent or civilizational superiority when the deep record keeps showing entanglement. The people once described as side branches may turn out to be contributors to the living present. The populations thought peripheral may have been central in ways the old map did not see. The landscapes assumed empty may have been full. The groups treated as belated may have preserved forms of knowledge older and more adaptive than the institutions that judge them. If our origins are wrong, then some of the confidence with which modern people have ranked one another begins to look historically illiterate. Then there is civilization itself, that grand word that tends to enter a room expecting admiration. If the old beginning is wrong, civilization loses some of its monopoly on meaning. We may still use the term for large, settled, literate, administratively complex societies. There is practical value in that, but the emotional halo around the word begins to dim. Civilization stops looking like the singular arrival of real humanity and starts looking like one family of human arrangements among others. Important, influential, often magnificent. Certainly also vulnerable, unstable, and by no means the only form in which intelligence, order, beauty, or social depth can appear. That shift is useful because civilization has often been used as a moral complement rather than a descriptive category. To call one group civilized and another not was rarely a neutral observation. It implied authority, legitimacy, superiority, and often the right to rearrange other people's lives in the name of improvement. Once we admit that humans were building rich symbolic worlds, large ritual centers, broad trade networks, and sophisticated adaptive systems long before or outside the societies we usually call civilizations, the moral vanity attached to the word begins to look less justified. The city is no longer the place where humanity first became impressive. It is one impressive outcome among several. A fifth thing changes, and this one reaches into how we understand knowledge itself. Modern societies often assume that knowledge accumulates steadily. We build on what came before. We preserve records. We refine techniques. We improve tools. Much of the time this is true. But if the deeper past involved repeated losses, regional collapses, drowned worlds, disappearing corridors, interrupted continuity, and societies forced to begin again with only fragments, then knowledge must also be understood as fragile. It can be lost. Because people become foolish, but because circumstances stop supporting transmission. This is a rather sobering thought. We tend to look back and assume that if ancient people did not possess some technique or system, they had not yet thought of it. Sometimes that is true. But sometimes the issue may not be invention at all. It may be preservation. Some forms of knowledge, especially those tied to local landscapes, oral memory, specialist roles, or seasonal conditions, are extremely vulnerable to disruption. If a coastline drowns, a route fails, a ritual center is abandoned, or a population disperses, whole worlds of practical and symbolic expertise can vanish within a few generations. The surviving descendants are not lesser. They are simply carrying fewer intact threads from what came before. That idea changes how we view the past, and quietly the present as well. We become a little less smug about our own permanence. We begin to see modern civilization not as the final secure vault of all knowledge, but as another fragile arrangement dependent on stable conditions, infrastructure, and continuity. If enough pressure arrives in the wrong places, even a technologically sophisticated society can lose capacities faster than it expects. This is not an argument for doom. It is an argument for humility. The past stops being a museum of primitive errors and becomes a reminder that memory is hard work. There is also a change in how we think about myth. If our origins are wrong in the strictly literal and linear sense, then myths no longer have to be treated only as childish errors eventually corrected by science. That does not mean myths become scientific treatises in disguise. They do not, but they may begin to look more like cultural vessels carrying memory, fear, loss, place, migration, catastrophe, and social meaning across immense spans of time. Once drowned landscapes, climatic shocks, and repeated resets enter the picture, stories of flood, wandering, lost. Homelands or worlds remade by water and sky begin to sound less like embarrassing superstition and more like one of the ways humans metabolize reality before measurements came with decimal points. This does not collapse science into myth or myth into science. It simply means the border between them becomes more interesting. Science can tell us that sea levels rose, climates shifted, populations mixed, and certain landscapes vanished. Myth may tell us how such changes lived in memory. One gives mechanism, chronology, and material process. The other gives emotion, value, and social meaning. If the origin story becomes less tidy, we may need both kinds of human record, handled carefully, to understand what actually happened and what it felt like to those who lived through it. Even religion changes slightly under this pressure, or at least the way some people approach it. Many religious traditions contain creation stories, flood stories, migration narratives, moral resets, and ancestral beginnings. These have often been forced into a false contest with scientific origin accounts, as though one side must win and the other must be escorted from the building. But if science itself now points toward complexity, repeated transformation, and the fragility of continuity, then some old religious narratives may be read less as failed science and more as enduring attempts to think seriously about exactly those conditions. Where we came from, what was lost, how order emerges, how worlds begin again after rupture, and why humans remember through story. Politics changes too, and perhaps this is where people become most uncomfortable. National histories love deep roots. They love firsts, founders, and clean lines of descent. They love claiming land through narratives of ancient continuity, unique civilizational destiny, or original belonging uncontaminated by mixture. But the deeper human past keeps suggesting movement, overlap, shared ancestry, contested landscapes. Identities form through contact rather than pristine isolation. That does not erase local history or ancestral rights. Those are serious matters. But it does make simplistic political uses of origin stories harder to sustain with a straight face. A species born in mixture is a poor mascot for ethnic purity. There is a related change in how we think about time. If our origins are wrong, then deep time becomes less decorative and more active in the present. The past is no longer something completed behind us. It becomes a force still shaping assumptions, institutions, prejudices, and ideals. The way we imagine the first humans affects the way we imagine the last few thousand years. If we think history is a staircase, we build societies around competition for the top. If we think it is a branching network with repeated losses and recoveries, we may place more value on resilience, diversity, and memory. That is not a small difference. Education would change under this view as well, at least in spirit. Instead of teaching children that human history is a neat sequence from cave to city to smartphone, we might teach that humans have always been intelligent, always adaptive, always capable of symbolic life, and that the forms those capacities take depend on environment, contact, and continuity. We might teach that no single society owns complexity. We might teach that what survives materially is not always what mattered most. We might even teach that being modern does not mean being better in every human sense, only being later, and later is not the same as wiser. It would be a slightly humbler curriculum, possibly also a more useful one. Even the way we approach the future might shift. A straight-line origin story quietly encourages a straight-line expectation for what comes next. More technology, more centralization, more mastery, more growth, more layers built on top of the old. But if the true human story includes distributed emergence, adaptation through diversity, repeated resets and recovery from loss, then resilience may matter more than sheer accumulation. A society that knows only how to intensify may be less durable than one that remembers how to adapt. The past under this view does not flatter our sense of unstoppable advancement. It advises preparedness, flexibility, and perhaps a little respect for people who managed complexity without needing a server farm. There is something else that changes too, and it may be the deepest shift of all. Wonder becomes less attached to singular beginnings and more attached to ongoing becoming. We are used to searching for the first moment, the first true human, the first city, the first ritual, symbol, the first crossing. These are useful questions, but they can make us miss the broader miracle, which is that human beings kept becoming under changing conditions, not once, but repeatedly in different places, under different skies, with different neighbors, facing different catastrophes. Humanity may not be a thing that happened and then sat complete. It may be something that keeps assembling itself through memory, mixture, adaptation, and care. That is a less theatrical idea than a single grand origin, but perhaps a more accurate one. It also carries a moral hint. If humanity is something repeatedly made rather than once achieved, then what matters is not just where we came from, but what we continue to preserve, transmit, and rebuild. Intelligence alone does not guarantee continuity. Neither does technology, neither does power. The deep past keeps suggesting that survival belongs to those who can remember, connect, adapt, and begin again without forgetting too much. So if our origins are wrong, what else changes? Quite a lot. Progress becomes less linear. Intelligence becomes broader. Identity becomes less pure and more truthful. Civilization becomes less of a crown and more of a category. Knowledge becomes fragile. Myth becomes more interesting. Politics loses some convenient fantasies. Education becomes humbler. The future becomes less about inevitability and more about resilience. And humanity itself begins to look less like a finished achievement and more like a long, unfinished practice. That can be unsettling at first. People tend to like firm beginnings because firm beginnings make the rest feel manageable. But there is another way to take it. If the story is broader, stranger, and less settled than we thought, then we are not standing at the end of a solved narrative. We are still inside it, still inheriting pieces of older worlds, still misunderstanding some of them, and still trying to work out what kind of species emerges from so much mixture, loss, invention, and recovery. Which leaves us with one final stretch of road to follow, and with a beginning that may be less like a single dawn than a long night filled with many lights, some vanished, some still visible, and some only now coming into view. By now, the idea of a single clean beginning may feel a little less convincing than it did at the start, and that is probably for the best. Human beings are very fond of neat stories, especially when those stories happen to place us at the satisfying end of a long upward process. We like the sense that the past was building towards something recognizable, that our species emerged clearly, advanced steadily, and eventually arrived at the modern world with only the occasional detour, a few memorable mammoths, and some light administrative confusion along the way. But the deeper we have looked, the harder that tidy version has been to maintain. The evidence keeps nudging us towards something older, broader, more uneven, and far less obedient to the sort of timeline one might print on a classroom wall. That is what makes this long question of origin so interesting. It is not only about where we began. It is about how we began, how often the beginning had to be made again, how much of it may have been lost, and how much of what we call humanity was assembled gradually across many populations, many places, and many difficult changes in the world. Once you start taking that seriously, the old image of a bright single dawn becomes less persuasive. In its place, something else appears, not one sunrise, but a long night of beginnings. That may sound dramatic, but the idea itself is quite practical. If the human story was shaped by repeated migration, contact, separation, innovation, disaster, memory, and recovery, then there may never have been one moment when humanity simply arrived in complete form. There may have been many thresholds, many partial beginnings, many local worlds in which something recognizably human intensified, deepened, or was preserved against difficult odds. In one place, anatomy shifts toward what we would later recognize as our own. In another, symbolic behavior becomes visible. Elsewhere, social complexity takes on new forms. In another region still, survival through environmental stress required planning, mobility, and cooperation at a scale that leaves only faint traces behind. Put all that together over immense stretches of time, and the beginning starts to look less like an event and more like an accumulation. That can feel slightly unsatisfying at first, mainly because human beings like a firm answer. We like the first person, the first sight, the first breakthrough, the first city, the first crossing, the first fully modern human. We are always searching for the clean opening. The curtain rises and everyone knows their role. Nature does not seem especially interested in providing that sort of theatre. It prefers long preparations, overlapping populations, local experiments, extinctions, mixtures, and the occasional discovery that turns out to have been sitting in a cave or under a seabed, waiting for us to become a little less sure of ourselves. And perhaps that is exactly the right emotional tone for the story of origins. Not certainty, but patience. Not a triumphant parade of ancestors all marching in the proper direction, but a deep and often hidden history of beings very like us, or partly like us, adapting to landscapes that changed faster than comfort allows. Some of those landscapes are gone now. Some lie beneath the sea. Some are buried under sand. Some were scraped by ice, drowned by rising water, or transformed by drought into places that later generations would have found almost impossible to imagine as home. Yet people were there. They lived, moved, traded, buried, remembered, built, argued, adapted, and sometimes disappeared so thoroughly that only a fragment of bone or a shifting genetic signal now hints at their existence. There is something deeply humbling in that. The modern world can make us feel surrounded by evidence of ourselves. We write everything down, build in durable materials, photograph our lunch, record our voices, map our streets, tag our locations, and generally behave as if posterity will have no trouble finding us. But for most of human existence, life did not preserve itself so generously. Most people left no inscriptions. Most houses rotted away. Most stories were carried in memory rather than ink. Most skill lived in hands, habits, and places rather than institutions. If continuity broke, much of that world could vanish quickly. That means the deep human past was almost certainly richer than the surviving record suggests. Not richer in the fantastical sense people sometimes crave, richer in the genuinely meaningful one. More populations, more local worlds, more adaptive strategies, more remembered places, more social forms, more interrupted continuities. And more beginnings that did not last long enough to become the official version. That may be the central lesson of this entire question. Human history is not only a story of emergence. It is also a story of survival through loss. We tend to focus on invention, and quite rightly, because invention is impressive. But continuity may be even more impressive. A useful technique survives only if it can be taught. A way of life survives only if enough of the world that supports it remains in place. A ritual survives only if the people, places, and meanings around it continue to exist. A language survives only if someone still speaks it to a child. Once climate shifts, coastlines drown, corridors close, or populations fragment, earlier worlds can be reduced astonishingly quickly to fragments and memory. The survivors are not lesser. They are simply carrying what could be carried. This is why the long night of beginnings is not a story of ignorance waiting for enlightenment. It is a story of repeated assembly under pressure. Human capacities did not emerge neatly and then expand without interruption. They deepened, mixed, disappeared from view, resurfaced, and took different forms in different regions. Symbolic life may have intensified in more than one place. Social cooperation may have reached remarkable levels long before cities. Knowledge may have been both highly advanced and locally fragile. Some populations may have solved problems we barely perceive because the evidence for the problem itself has vanished. Others may have adapted brilliantly to conditions so unlike our own that we still underestimate what it took to live there. There is also the matter of scale, which can be hard for the mind to hold on to at bedtime, though perhaps bedtime is the best time for it. We are dealing with spans so immense that even great human achievements can look like brief flickers. 1,000 years feels enormous in ordinary life. In deep history, it is often only a phase. Whole social patterns can appear, transform, and vanish inside time ranges that geology treats as a passing mood. And yet, within those spans, individual lives were as immediate as ours are now. People worried about weather, food, children, injury, rivals, trust, and what lay beyond the next ridge. They likely laughed at things that would make no sense to us at all, which is only fair, because we do much the same in reverse. The long night of beginnings was not populated by abstractions. It was lived one person at a time, one family at a time, one campfire, journey, drought, shoreline, and burial at a time. That is easy to forget when looking at maps and timelines. The maps make movement look smooth. The timelines make transitions look orderly. But no one experienced prehistory as a diagram. They experienced it as weather, hunger, kinship, memory, fear, wonder, obligation, and practical decision. A greener corridor is not just an opportunity on a paleoclimate chart. It is a place where people can travel, exchange, marry, follow game, or return to ancestral ground. A rising sea is not just a post-glacial process. It is the loss of camps, roots, shell beds, fishing grounds, graves, and familiar edges of the world. A population bottleneck is not just a genetic statistic. It is a much smaller number of people having to keep enough alive to continue. Once you see the past in those terms, the old desire for one pure beginning starts to feel strangely inadequate. Why should there be one? Why should a species as mobile, social, adaptable, and entangled as ours have begun in a singular, neatly bounded way? It makes more sense that we emerge through structured populations, through contact and separation, through partial traits appearing at different times, through repeated mixing, and through long stretches in which many kinds of humans shared the planet. It also makes more sense that some of those human worlds were later erased or hidden before they could leave the kind of material confidence modern people prefer. And that returns us to the title of this whole journey. Because the possibility that everything we thought about our origins may be wrong is not really about throwing away knowledge. It is about letting go of a style of certainty that was too rigid for the evidence. We do know a great deal. We know that Africa is central to our species' deep history. We know that modern humans interacted with and interbred with other human groups. We know that social, symbolic, and technological complexity reaches deep into prehistory. We know that environmental change repeatedly reshaped the conditions of human life. We know that sea levels transformed coastlines and hid habitable worlds. We know that memory, myth, and place may preserve more of those transformations than earlier scholars allowed. And we know that the record we study is fragmentary, biased by preservation, and always subject to revision when better methods or new finds appear. That is not ignorance. That is a serious body of knowledge. What changes is the shape of the story. Instead of one beginning, there are many thresholds. Instead of one path, there are braided lines. Instead of one uninterrupted climb, there are advances, collapses, recoveries, and rediscoveries. Instead of one central humanity gradually spreading outward in perfect form, there is a broader field of human becoming. Some lines continue, some merge, some vanish. Some leave only faint traces in genomes, landscapes, or stories. Humanity in that sense begins again and again wherever enough memory, teaching, and social life survive to carry it forward. That may sound almost philosophical, but it is practical too. Every generation remakes humanity in miniature. Children are not born knowing language, ritual, ethics, history, or they are taught. They are brought into a human world by others. If that chain breaks, something is lost. If it survives, the beginning happens again. In that sense, the deepest origins and the present moment are not so far apart. The same species that once crossed drowned plains, watched grasslands fail, buried its dead with care, and told stories of changing worlds is still here, still trying to preserve enough continuity to remain itself under conditions that never stay stable for long. There is something oddly comforting in that, even if it is not especially tidy. It means that humanity was never a finished object handed to the future fully assembled. It was always a process of carrying forward what mattered, adapting what could not remain the same, and rebuilding coherence after disruption. That makes our ancestors look less like crude early versions of us, and more like colleagues in a very long project. Their tools were different, their cosmologies were different, their landscapes were different, but the work was recognizably human. They had to decide what to keep, what to teach, where to move, whom to trust, what to remember, and how to live when the world changed around them. Those are not primitive problems. They are permanent ones. So perhaps the long night of beginnings is not a dark age before the light. Perhaps it is the long condition from which all later lights emerged. A stretch of time so vast and so partially hidden that we can only see it in flashes. A carved object, a burial, a set of footprints, a genetic trace, a drowned shelf, a remembered flood, a changed climate, a cave wall marked by intention. None of these alone gives the whole story, but together they suggest that the past was never as empty as the old diagrams implied. It was crowded with possibilities, with human and near-human lives, with local worlds that mattered absolutely to the people inside them and were later reduced to fragments by time. And now, as we come to the end. Of this journey, or perhaps just to a pause within it, it is worth noticing how different the question feels from when we began. At first, origins can sound like a search for a fact, a point on a map, a specimen, a date, but by the time you follow the evidence through all its interruptions, hidden landscapes, mixed populations, fragile reconstructions, and remembered catastrophes, the question becomes larger. It becomes a question about how stories are made, how knowledge survives, how much has been lost, and whether what endured into the present is only one portion of what humanity once was. Wherever you are listening from tonight, and whatever hour it is in your little part of the world, that may be worth carrying for a moment before sleep takes over. Somewhere behind your own life, behind your family, your language, your home, your routines, your plans for tomorrow, lies this immense and irregular depth of time. Not a straight road, not a single dawn, but a long night filled with beginnings. Some remembered, some erased, some still surfacing from the ground, the sea, and the quiet places of old stories. And if this slow walk through our uncertain beginnings has given you a little calm, or a little wonder, or simply a gentler way to end the day, I would be very grateful if you gave the video a like, maybe subscribed, and shared this quiet corner with someone else who enjoys large questions handled at a slower pace. It helps this small space keep going, and it helps these old mysteries find good company. For now, though, it is enough just to let the question rest beside you. Maybe our origins were never one clear opening scene. Maybe they were many small starts, many survivals, many recoveries stitched together across time until eventually they became us. And if that is true, then the story of humanity is not less remarkable for being less simple. It is more remarkable, stranger, certainly harder to summarize, much more resistant to tidy confidence, but also more honest, more human, and perhaps more deserving of our patience. So rest well wherever and whenever you are. The past will still be there in the morning, quietly unfinished, still holding some of its answers in the dark.